The sea whispers of forgotten kings. The stones of ruined temples hold secrets, carved by hands now dust. And in the smoky twilight of myth and history, a world of gods, tyrants, warriors, and poets still breathes. Tonight, we go back to a time when democracy was born in blood, when philosophy and conquest danced a dangerous waltz, and when even mortals dared to challenge Olympus. Welcome to the cradle of civilization. Welcome to ancient Greece. The morning began not with a rush, but with a stirring, soft and slow, like the breath of wind through the fig leaves outside. In a modest Athenian courtyard, shaded by the twisting limbs of an old olive tree, the light filtered down as a pale golden hush, brushing the terracotta tiles and sun-warmed stone. A cockerel called out from somewhere beyond the wall. Its cry echoed against the stone lanes and low-roofed homes, announcing the arrival of the day to a city that had already begun to stir in silence. Athens in the 4th century BCE was not a place of urgency, not in the early hours. It was a place of rhythm, where the gods watched over the living from marble altars and household hearths alike. In a corner of the courtyard, a small fire cracked and whispered. A pot of barley porridge sat low in the embers, releasing the faint scent of grain and smoke into the air. Nearby, flat rounds of bread, crisp on the edges, warm at the center, were wrapped in linen, their crusts still holding the heat from the small domed oven. These were the simplest things, and yet sacred in their own way. Olive oil was drizzled lightly, golden and glistening, harvested from the very tree whose shade reached across the courtyard floor. The house itself was quiet but alive. A child's sandal scuffed lightly across the floor, dragging a rhythm that would fade as the door was slid open and the child vanished into the light. Clay jugs stood in corners, each bearing the thumbprints of their maker. Above the hearth, hanging from blackened beams, were bunches of dried herbs, oregano, thyme, wild mint, fragrant reminders of the hills beyond the city. A man, our philosopher, rose from his pallet in the corner room. He was not young nor old, but lived in that timeless space where age bends beneath thought. His hands were rough, not from labor, but from the constant turning of pages, the handling of scrolls, the absent rubbing of the temple, while the mind wrestled with abstraction. He did not speak as he dressed, slipping a simple himation over his shoulder. The fabric was coarse but clean, bleached by sun and time. A belt, knotted loosely at the waist. Sandals placed carefully on feet still cool from the night's air. In the corner of the room stood a low table with a basin beside it. He washed his face and hands as the sun reached higher, fingers dripping with the chill of water drawn from the cistern. Beside the basin lay a small clay figurine of Hermes, the messenger god and patron of travelers. It had been given to him as a child, and though its features were softened with age, it had followed him through every chapter of life. He sat then in the courtyard and took his morning bread in silence. It was dipped in oil, then in salt, then brought to the lips with reverence. This was not indulgence, but ritual. To eat slowly, to taste fully, was to honor the body and the earth alike. The street beyond the courtyard wall began to hum with the sounds of the city awakening. Hooves clicked on stone. Merchants shouted greetings to one another in coarse Doric or melodic Ionian. Women passed by with baskets of dates, trailing the scent of myrrh and morning labor. Children chased one another down the lanes, their laughter bouncing off marble columns. But within the walls, the philosopher remained still. He closed his eyes, listening not only to the world around him, but to the gentle unfolding of the self. He thought of eudaimonia, the flourishing life, the good life, not one of wealth or fame, but one of balance, of inquiry, of deep and lasting peace. His thoughts drifted to Plato, now years departed, whose words had once stirred such fire in him beneath the porticos of the academy. He thought of Socrates before him, who walked the very streets now waking with life, barefoot and wide-eyed, questioning even the wind. And he thought too of Heraclitus, whose fire burned in riddles. You cannot step into the same river twice. The porridge cooled. A fig was plucked from the bowl beside it. The day had begun. In the rear of the house, a servant swept the floor with measured grace, her broom tracing arcs in the dust like a scribe's stylus across parchment. She did not speak, and the philosopher did not interrupt. There was a shared understanding that these early hours were to be kept sacred. Speech would return in time. He rose once more and walked through the portico. Painted pots lined the wall, each bearing symbols and myths. Persephone and Hades in a dance of death and rebirth. Athena springing fully armoured from Zeus's head, Orpheus singing to the stones. These images were more than art, they were memory, they were teaching. By the doorway sat his walking stick, carved from pale olive wood, smoothed by years of use. He took it in hand, not for need but for rhythm. There was something about its touch, warm from the morning sun, cool from the shaded entry, that made him feel grounded. Before stepping into the light, he paused. On a small shelf above the door sat a bowl of offerings, honey, olives, a coin. These were not for the gods in the sky, but for the spirits of the home. Hestia, guardian of the hearth. Hermes, ever the guide. The philosopher whispered a blessing, neither long nor elaborate, but sincere. The door opened with a soft creak, and the city stretched out before him. The marble gleamed white and rose in the distance, the Acropolis catching the sun like a crown. Columns rose from temples like flutes of stone. The air smelled of dust, citrus, and hearth smoke. The philosopher stepped into it all with a slow and knowing breath. He turned down a lane edged with worn flagstones, his sandals slapping softly. On one wall, a vine had crept its way up toward a carved lintel, its leaves trembling in the breeze. From a nearby window came the notes of a reed flute, tentative and beautiful, played by a child learning the melodies passed down for generations. This was Athens, a city of order and chaos, of questioning and worship, of politics and poetry. A place where the mind could stretch and bend, where the tongue was trained in both rhetoric and restraint. And here, in the pulse of it all, walked a man seeking not greatness, but understanding. The day was still young, but the path had already begun. He would visit the agora soon, and then the painted stoa. Perhaps he would listen to a debate, or offer a question of his own. But for now, he walked in silence, letting the rhythm of sandals on stone carry him forward. And behind him, the soft scent of olive oil and morning smoke still lingered in the folds of his robe. There is a tale the elders tell in quiet courtyards, often after the bread is eaten and the wine has softened the air. It is not written in any scroll, but it lives between the words of philosophers, in the hush between syllables, where wisdom breathes. Once long ago, in a grove outside Delphi, stood an olive tree that did not bear fruit. Not for 1 year or 10, but for as long as anyone could remember. Its bark was pale and worn, and though its branches reached high like fingers aching toward the heavens, no blossom had ever graced its limbs. Some said it was cursed, others simply neglected by the gods. But the tree remained. Through winters of frost and summers of dust it stood, a creaking thing, dry and gnarled, like an old man with stories to tell but no tongue to share them. One evening, a boy passed by the grove on his way to fetch water. He was poor and often alone, his thoughts deeper than his years, filled with questions no one around him could answer. Why are some born to labour and others to leisure? Why do the stars seem fixed while everything beneath them changes? Why must we live only to vanish? He stopped by the tree and, on a whim, pressed his hand to its bark. And the tree spoke, not in words but in a feeling, like warm breath across his thoughts. In that moment the boy heard, no, understood, that something lived within the trunk, not a dry spirit or ancient ghost, but a presence. And it whispered to him, You wonder about justice, it said. But can you define it without knowing injustice? You chase truth, but can you hold it, even in your palm? The boy returned the next day, and the next. He brought no offering, only silence and listening. Over time, the whispers grew clearer. They were not commandments, nor revelations, but gentle turnings of thought, questions shaped like seeds. Years passed. The boy became a youth and then a man. He left the village and studied in the city. He learned from teachers who wore clean robes and spoke with many words. Yet the lessons that stayed with him most deeply were not shouted from pulpits or etched in stone. They came from the old tree, whose voice had once creaked across his young mind like wind over a lyre. He returned only once to the grove, as an old man himself, his beard long, his eyes still hungry for meaning. The tree had fallen. Its branches lay twisted, half buried in leaves, and moss grew thick across its trunk. No fruit had ever come, no grove had bloomed around it. But the man knelt beside it all the same and whispered, "You bore something greater than olives." It is said that the man never taught in a school, never wrote a single scroll. Yet travellers sought him out, and those who left his company did not leave with answers, but with better questions. Some now say the tree was a whispering of Hermes himself, the god of boundaries and thought, the bridge between things. Others say the tree was nothing more than a metaphor, told to make silence seem sacred. But among those who believe in small truths wrapped inside quiet tales, the story remains. The creaking tree, the listening boy, and the God who asked more than he ever answered. There is something in this tale that speaks to the rhythm of inquiry, a reminder that wisdom is often not delivered in thunder but in rustle, in stillness, in the patient unfolding of time. In Athens, the streets are filled with debate and performance. But in the interstice of all that noise, a deeper kind of learning lingers, the kind that begins not with declaration but with humility, with a hand pressed to rough bark and the willingness to listen without demand. Socrates taught in questions, Diogenes in acts, Plato in symbols, but even the philosopher who walks alone with the morning wind may be guided by that same unseen voice, the presence that does not proclaim but inquires. What is virtue? What is love? What is the shape of a good life? These are not puzzles to be solved like riddles, but doors to be passed through again and again. And sometimes the best teacher is not the one who speaks, but the one who waits for us to ask differently. So in the cool shade of olive branches, between the warmth of bread and the smoke of morning, we pause, not for answers, but for questions worthy of sitting with, just as the boy once did. The philosopher walked slowly, letting his sandals scuff gently across the sun-warmed stones of the agora. The marble beneath his feet had been worn smooth by countless footsteps, farmers, potters, slaves, merchants, and the occasional poet trailing ideas like incense. Here, in this open square, the city hummed. The sun was still rising above Mount Hymettus, casting golden light across the rooftops of Athens and spilling down into the heart of civic life. He moved through the early morning chatter with the stillness of someone observing a dream. His hands were clasped behind his back, and his robe, bleached clean by the Mediterranean sun, stirred softly in the breeze. Around him the agora came alive. A woman with a woven basket offered olives, their oil-dark skins glistening. A fisherman had laid out yesterday's catch on cool clay tiles, the scales of the fish shimmering like beaten silver. Nearby, the smith's hammer began its daily rhythm, steady and sharp. The sound rang out like a bell, craft shaping material, purpose ringing in metal. The philosopher paused near the stoa, the shaded colonnade where debates sometimes unfolded like drama. A pair of youths were already engaged in a spirited exchange, one gesturing with wild conviction, the other frowning with narrowed eyes. But if justice is only what benefits the strong, the first was saying, then how can the weak ever appeal to right? The other laughed. Because the weak have stories, and stories convince fools. They didn't notice the older man listening nearby, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. He moved on. His walk took him past potters arranging their work, red figure craters, oil lamps shaped like tiny lions, amphorae with sea motifs. He admired a kylix painted with Dionysus reclining beneath vines, eyes half-lidded with divine pleasure. The potter gave him a nod, and he returned it. A group of children ran past, chasing a worn leather ball. Their laughter filled the morning. One tripped and fell with a yelp. Another helped him up with a dust-covered smile. The philosopher watched them with a faint expression, part memory, part philosophy. There was much to learn from how children moved through the world, without artifice, without pretense. They did not yet posture or clothe their thoughts in cleverness. They asked plainly, "Why is the sky blue?" Or, "Where does the soul go when the body sleeps?" And they did not expect answers that made perfect sense. They accepted wonder as a full reply. He walked on, past the altar where a priest lit a small offering, a bowl of barley and a curl of incense for Hestia. The flame flickered, soft and low, almost bashful in the bright daylight. The priest murmured the ancient words with reverence, even as the sound of market voices grew louder around him. Not far off, a chorus of men laughed as they sipped watered wine beneath a fig tree. One of them noticed the philosopher passing and raised a hand. "Tell us, teacher, is it more virtuous to drink early or late?" The others chuckled. He smiled, paused just long enough to reply, "It depends on whether you drink for pleasure or to forget your duty." A few nodded appreciatively. One groaned. He moved on. The Agora was not merely a market. It was the heart of Athens, where commerce met culture, where citizens debated policy and playwrights honed their lines. Here statues stood as silent reminders of Athena, protector of the city, of Hermes, god of speech and swift exchange. Inscriptions lined the walls, laws etched in stone for all to see. Democracy was visible here, in speech and contest, in olive sellers and lawgivers occupying the same space. A philosopher did not speak loudly here, but he listened carefully. He observed the weaver threading his loom, each line of wool a tension between strength and softness. He watched the water carrier, muscles taut beneath his tunic, moving with the grace of someone who has lifted the same weight since childhood. He noticed how the words of a fishmonger shaped the attention of a buyer, how even ordinary language, if wielded well, had the power to alter choice. There was no part of the Agora untouched by thought. Even silence here had a kind of discourse to it, the silence of comparison, of consideration, of daily human theatre. At the edge of the square stood a tree, old and bent, its roots half exposed. He sat beneath it for a while, resting in the shade, the sounds of the marketplace a distant murmur. A cicada sang in the branches above. Time slowed. A young woman sat nearby, stringing beads onto a necklace. Her fingers moved with practiced rhythm, but her eyes were far away. He spoke without looking at her. "Do you work? Or do you think while working?" She looked up, slightly startled. "Both," she said. "I remember stories my mother told, of Helen, of the goddess who rose from foam. I think of what they mean. And what do they mean to you? That beauty is not always a blessing, that gods walk among us but leave chaos in their wake." He nodded slowly. "Good." She offered him a bead. "Do you want one?" He held it between thumb and forefinger. "Even this has weight." As the sun rose higher, the shadows shrank. The agora grew crowded. The voices grew louder. A procession passed, a small shrine to Apollo on a cart pulled by 2 oxen. Children followed behind, singing softly. The philosopher rose. His steps turned toward the shaded path that would take him back toward the hills, to the fig trees and stillness where he could think. The agora would remain as it always had, buzzing with opinion and intention, pulsing with the imperfect poetry of human life. But as he walked away, he carried its questions with him, wrapped not in papyrus or ink, but in breath and dust and memory. The kind of knowledge that grows not in the classroom, but under the open sky. The sun dipped lower, and the white stone of the city softened from glare to glow. Along the narrow shaded path behind the Stoa of Atalos, the philosopher found a quiet bench, cracked and warmed by the afternoon. A boy passed with a jug, freshly drawn from the communal fountain. The philosopher lifted a hand in quiet greeting. The boy paused. "Would you like a cup, sir?" "I would, and thank you." He took the wooden ladle, dipped it into the jug, and drank slowly. The water was cool, slightly mineral-rich from the city's aqueducts, and more refreshing than any wine. He looked at the boy, who stood with bare feet and a tunic too long for his frame. "Do you run errands for the merchants?" the philosopher asked. Sometimes, or for the priest, or my father when he lets me. And what do you want to be when you're older? The boy frowned at the question. I don't know. Someone who doesn't carry jugs. The philosopher smiled. Fair, but even jug carriers carry the weight of ideas. Do you listen to the men talking in the square? The boy nodded. I heard one man say the stars are just fires, hung above us like lamps in a temple. And do you believe that? I don't know. He hesitated. I think they're too far away for us to know anything real about them. Good. That's the beginning of philosophy, not certainty, but the willingness to wonder aloud. The boy tilted his head. But you're a philosopher. Aren't you supposed to know things? I know that I know little, the philosopher replied gently, and that this is a city where people pretend to know far more than they do. He dipped the ladle again, offering the boy a drink this time. They both drank in silence, the stone wall behind them warm with the memory of the sun. After a pause, the boy asked, Do you think the gods live in the sky? The philosopher looked up, where the first star flickered faintly against the blue fading into dusk. I think the gods live wherever people believe they do, and maybe more importantly, wherever people act as if someone is watching. The boy was quiet. Then, as if startled by his own thoughts, he said, My grandmother says Athena watches over the city from the hill, that if I speak kindly to strangers, she notices. Then she's a wise woman. There are worse beliefs to live by. They sat for a moment longer, and then the boy shifted, prepared to leave. Thank you for the water, the philosopher said. Thank you for the talk, the boy replied, and then ran down the path with the jug swinging at his side, barefoot on the stone. The philosopher sat a little while longer, letting the coolness of the cup and the boy's questions settle in his bones like evening dew. The agora, he thought, was more than trade and speech. It was learning passed in whispers, kindness exchanged without cost, a city built not only of marble, but of listening. The sun was well on its climb when the philosopher stepped down from the colonnade into the heart of the city, the agora. From the shaded portico of the stoa to the open plaza, there was a shift in temperature and in sound, like passing through a veil. The white stones underfoot were warm already, and the air hummed with the breath of the polis. Here, beneath the open sky, Athens exhaled. The scent of olives, salted fish, figs and beeswax filled the space between people. Dust rose with every footstep. Market stalls leaned beneath the weight of clay vessels, bolts of dyed linen, bowls of honeycomb and amphorae sealed with wax. Merchants barked prices in coarse Attic Greek. Farmers from the hills spread out olives in neat rows, and children ducked between legs to steal glances at foreign goods. An older man walked past with parchment scrolls bound in leather, while two women stood arm in arm, examining a basket of almonds. It was not chaos. No, it was choreography, a slow, instinctive movement that only those born to the city truly understood. The philosopher stood in it as one might stand in a river, letting its current swirl gently about his knees. He did not come to buy today. He came to listen. A young orator was practicing on a stone platform, barely attended. He shouted about justice and oaths, quoting something from the tragedians. His voice cracked in the heat. A few passers-by stopped out of politeness or habit before moving on. The philosopher made a note of the boy's phrasing, the trembling in his vowels. Rhetoric is only as firm as the breath that carries it. Further on, by the statue of Hermes, two men argued about taxes. One spoke with the calm conviction of the landholding class, the other with the sharpness of a man who handled his own wheat. Their disagreement was fierce but not cruel. There was room in the agora for contradiction. That, the philosopher thought, was part of its sacredness. The agora was not just a marketplace, it was the living soul of Athens, not merely a venue of commerce but of conscience. Here was where laws were debated, verdicts issued, policies announced. In the shade of stoas and beneath the gaze of gods immortalized in bronze, men gathered not only to buy and sell but to argue, to learn, to teach. A philosopher could speak freely here as long as he offended no one too severely. It had not always been safe. One could recall how Socrates' questions had stirred too deeply. But that had been another time, another fever. These days, questions were met with furrowed brows, not hemlock. He paused near a stone bench where a potter displayed oil lamps shaped like owls and hares. The detail was meticulous, each tiny feather etched with a wooden stylus before the clay was fired. Beside the potter sat a jar of cool water, and a small child humming softly, shaping wet clay into something only she could name. "Beautiful work," the philosopher said gently. The potter nodded. "It sells better if they think it was made by hands, that dream." The philosopher smiled. "Are your hands awake or dreaming now?" "Both," the potter said, "like the city." He wandered further. The ground here had been trodden by centuries of sandals, by generals and poets, by thieves and priests. The philosopher's thoughts followed the rhythm of the crowd. Movement, pause, observation. What was it, he asked himself, that kept the city alive? Not muscle, not stone, not wealth. It was logos, reasoned speech, the great thread that bound one man's mind to another's, the shared conversation of a people. Even in buying onions or haggling over the price of cheese, there was logos. Every word uttered in the agora was a claim. I exist, I desire, I believe. And every reply was a negotiation of that claim. What is man, if not a creature in constant dialogue? He recalled a phrase, "The city is man writ large." In the agora, this was made visible. Here was the mind of the city, chattering and laughing and debating with itself, solving its own riddles, just as a soul might wrestle with conflicting desires. He passed a group of young men, listening to an elder retelling a tale of the Battle of Marathon, gesturing broadly with a fig in hand. The young men nodded, half listening, more interested in a girl buying roses nearby. Human nature, the philosopher thought, not noble, not base, but in between. A strange mix of reason and hunger, and yet from that mix came philosophy, art, mathematics, love. Near the center of the square stood a bronze of Athena, her spear held high. Doves rested on her helm. The philosopher stopped to look. "I wonder," he thought aloud, "what it is she sees." A voice beside him said, "The same things she always has, ambition, foolishness, beauty and pride." It was an old man with a crooked back wrapped in a woolen cloak despite the warmth. A former magistrate, perhaps, or a teacher retired from the Lyceum. He squinted at the statue as if trying to read its expression. The philosopher nodded. "Do you think she ever tires of us?" The man chuckled. "Tires? Perhaps. But the gods are patient, or at least amused." They shared a moment of silence, watching as a dog chased pigeons past the base of the statue. "Do you teach?" the old man asked. "I speak, when there are ears willing to hear." The old man smiled. "Then speak. Speak until someone listens. That's what keeps the city breathing." As the sun began to tilt westward, the noise of the square mellowed. Shadows lengthened. Stall holders adjusted awnings. The smell of roasted garlic and barley bread drifted through the air, drawing thoughts toward the evening meal. A boy ran past with a hoop, laughter trailing behind him like a ribbon. An old woman scolded him softly in a dialect the philosopher did not know. Near the fountain, a woman filled a pitcher and sang a lullaby from the islands. The rhythm was not Athenian. It reminded him that the agora was not only Greek, it was Ionian, Thracian, Cretan, occasionally even Persian or Egyptian. The breath of the city was not one breath, but many. He sat for a moment on a low wall, letting the marble cool his legs. A stray cat leapt beside him, curling with no fear into the crook of his arm. "I suppose even you find philosophy in the square," he murmured, scratching behind its ears. The cat blinked slowly. As the crowds thinned and the air cooled, the philosopher rose to leave. But before he turned away, he stood one last moment at the center of the agora, the heart of the polis. He closed his eyes and listened, not with ears, but with the part of the soul that listens to silence. And in that stillness, he heard it, the agora breathing. There is a hush that lives in ancient stones, a silence not of emptiness, but of listening. In Athens, that silence was found in the agora, the gathering place at the city's core. And if one leaned close, beneath the clamour of bartering, the dust of sandals, and the laughter of youth, one might feel that silence breathing, not lifeless, but waiting, for memory, for wisdom, for a voice to ask a question of the gods. Before it became a city of philosophers and democracy, Athens was a city of oracles. In practical terms, the agora, from the Greek agora meaning assembly or gathering, was a place where commerce and conversation intertwined. Built northeast of the Acropolis and developed over centuries, it was more than a market square. It was the epicenter of Athenian public life, a blend of government plaza, marketplace, law court, theatre, and schoolyard. It had temples and fountains, stoas for shaded meetings, and open spaces where citizens could be counted or summoned. The Stoa of Attalos, rebuilt centuries later by modern archaeologists, once sheltered shops and meeting rooms. The Tholos housed members of the council, offering free meals to officials as they governed, and scattered across the stones were herms, sacred boundary markers dedicated to Hermes, god of travellers and commerce, reminding all that movement between the mundane and the sacred was constant. But beneath the surface of civic bustle, older voices whispered, voices of myth and mystery. Before democracy took root, before speech and counter-speech ruled the polis, truth was sought in the prophecies of the gods and the oracles, those sacred individuals and institutions said to channel divine will, were the sanctioned interpreters. The most famous, of course, was the Oracle of Delphi, where the Pythia, priestess of Apollo, sat atop a tripod, inhaling vapors from the earth's breath and speaking words that twisted and shimmered like heat above a fire. Rulers, generals, and humble farmers alike traveled days or weeks to kneel before her, asking the same questions that all humans carry. What should I do? What will become of me? What is the will of the gods? Even in the age of logos and dialectic, when men like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle favored reason over divination, the oracles retained power. For in the Greek soul, there was always space for mystery, always a reverence for the unknowable. Oracles were not merely shrines, they were part of the cosmic architecture. According to myth, the first oracle at Delphi belonged to Gaia, the earth goddess, and was guarded by the great serpent Python. Apollo, in a demonstration of divine assertion, slew Python and claimed the site as his own. But even in taking it, he inherited the legacy of the chthonic, the earthbound wisdom of the deep. It was said that the Pythia entered trance not only through ritual, but because the spirit of Python still stirred in the navel of the world, the Omphalos stone, and that what she uttered was shaped by both Apollo's clarity and the earth's shadowy memory. In this way, Greek prophecy always held tension between light and dark, word and silence, clarity and ambiguity. And in the agora, where men gathered to debate ethics and policy, there was often a quiet yearning for the kind of certainty only an oracle could offer. Even as Athens built a world of law and reason, her people remained haunted by the idea that some truths could only be breathed, not spoken. It is easy to imagine a merchant, in the still hour before dawn, whispering a question to a small statue of Hermes beside his stall, or a soldier passing a bronze of Athena and asking, not out loud but in his heart, whether he would return from the next campaign. These were not formal oracles, but they reflected the everyday hunger for divination. Dreams, birds in flight, a shiver in the spine, all were read like texts. Within the agora, certain shrines had reputations for being responsive. The altar of the 12 gods, placed at the city's center, was both a sacred boundary and a place where citizens offered prayers, seeking divine response. It marked the 0 point from which distances to other cities were measured, a cosmic and civic orientation all in one. Nearby, the temple of Hephaestus, god of craftsmen and fire, overlooked the western edge. Pilgrims came to pray not just for skill, but for insight. Creativity itself was believed to be touched by divine inspiration. And always, the goddess Athena Polias presided silently from her home atop the Acropolis, her shield lifted, her eyes unblinking. She did not whisper like Apollo's priestess, but her wisdom was felt in the reasoned voice, the courageous act, the quiet judgment made in stone. As the classical age matured, Athens shifted emphasis from prophecy to dialogue, from trance to logic. Socrates questioned blindly accepted truths and redirected people not towards gods for answers, but toward the soul's internal oracle, the daimonion, a kind of inner voice or conscience. For him, the divine did not require ecstatic speech. It whispered from within, warning him when a path was false. Plato, too, absorbed the mythic into the rationale. His dialogues are filled with references to dreams, riddles, and divine madness, but always woven into a larger quest for truth through philosophical inquiry. Even Aristotle, the systematizer, wrote of wonder as the beginning of wisdom. While he catalogued the natural world and developed logical frameworks, he acknowledged that the soul seeks something more, something that rationality alone cannot satisfy. In this way, the Greek journey was not a rejection of the mystical, but a reframing. Oracles, omens, and myths were not discarded. They became poetic truths, metaphors that illuminated the shadows logic could not penetrate. So the philosopher walked to the agora not only as a man of reason, but as a man attuned to myth. Beneath each marble step was 1,000 whispered questions. Will my crops grow? Will the ships return? Will my son survive the plague? Should I marry her? Should I go to war? And always, the gods replied, sometimes with silence, sometimes through dreams, sometimes in the mirror of a stranger's eyes. Even today, in the ruins of the agora, one can feel the faint breath of those questions rising like mist at dawn. The stones are broken, the statues headless, the porticos worn to dust. But the space still listens, still remembers. In a dream, perhaps, a traveller finds herself walking those ancient paths. She hears a voice, her own perhaps, ask a question. And though no answer comes in words, the silence itself feels like a response, a kind of peace, a kind of knowing. The marble walkway echoed beneath his sandals, each step softened by the hush of the mid-morning shade. The columns of the Stoa Poikile rose like quiet sentinels, flanking the long portico where memory lingered not only in speech, but in colour, etched and painted onto walls that had seen centuries pass like drifting clouds. Here, in this painted porch, the air was cooler, not for the shadows alone, but for the reverence it held. The Stoa was no temple, yet it invited silence, the kind of silence in which thoughts gather, and ancient stories unfold again, not as relics, but as living companions. On the walls stretched scenes in brilliant ochres, reds, and black lines faded by time, but not by meaning. The Battle of Marathon, fierce and proud. Amazonomachy, the clash of Greeks and warrior women. The sack of Troy, with flames licking at the edges of memory. And walking further, he came upon the familiar face, lion skin across the back, club at his side, one hand extended not in violence, but in offering. Heracles, the hero, the punished, the man who had, in a fury of grief, slain his own family, and who then walked the long path of redemption through 12 labours, each more daunting than the last. A boy and an old man stood before the painting. The boy stared, wide-eyed. The elder spoke slowly, not just for the child's sake, but for the rhythm of remembering. "That one," he said, pointing to the wall, "is Heracles wrestling the Nemean lion. See how his hands grip the beast's throat, for no blade could pierce its hide. He had to match it in sheer force, man against nature, muscle against myth." The boy blinked. But why did he have to fight it? Because he had to become something greater than what he was. Not to win glory, though he won that too, but to carry the weight of his own past and turn it into strength. They stood in silence. The light shifted slightly, casting shadows over the lion's mane. And there, the old man continued, nodding toward another panel, is the Ceryneian hind, a golden creature sacred to Artemis. Heracles didn't kill that one. He chased it for a year, gently, always behind it, always respectful. Not every labor was one of violence. Sometimes the gods test our restraint more than our power. He smiled, more to himself than the boy. The philosopher watched from a few steps away, silent as if overhearing a sacred rite. The boy asked no more questions. His small shoulders seemed to settle as he looked again at Heracles' form, tall, enduring, more human now than he'd seemed before. He turned his gaze to the rest of the wall. So much of Greek identity lived here, not just in the deeds depicted, but in how they were told. The Stoa Poikile was both memory and mirror, a place where citizens were reminded of their shared past, their legends, and the values those legends seeded. In the far corner, near the last of the paintings, he sat on a cool bench of stone. There, within the hum of distant voices and the gentle coo of pigeons nesting in the roof beams, he let the old stories rise again within his mind. He thought of Theseus, the prince who volunteered to face the Minotaur, how he walked into darkness, guided only by thread and love, how he killed the beast, not with brute strength alone, but with courage tethered to clarity. And yet Theseus forgot to raise the white sails on his return. His father, Aegeus, watching from the cliffs, saw black sails and threw himself into the sea. Even heroes, the philosopher mused, leave sorrow in their wake. Yet their stories endure, not only for their triumphs, but for their imperfections. They remind us that the path to wisdom is not always lit by certainty. Often it's stumbled through, with regret, resilience, and reflection. Behind him the boy and elder moved on. Others passed, their robes whispering against marble. Time did not stand still here, but it did slow, as if pausing to breathe in the scent of oil lamps and sun-warmed limestone. He rose and walked to the final panel. A lesser-known scene, Heracles at the gates of Hades, leading the three-headed hound Cerberus with neither whip nor chain, just a steady hand and an agreement with death itself, to face death, not as a foe, but as a condition of life. That was true heroism. He closed his eyes for a moment. In the shaded stillness of the painted porch, surrounded by gods, beasts, and mortals made myth, he found not just memory, but meaning. Tomorrow's questions would come, but for now, among old stories and worn stone, he let the past speak its soft truths. The sun cast long golden angles along the colonnade of the Stoa Poikile, warming its marbled bones and drying the dew that clung to the crevices of ancient mortar. The name meant painted porch, but the phrase did little justice to the experience of walking beneath its shadowed roof, a structure that stood not just as shelter, but as a vessel of memory, of identity, and of reflection. In this place, Greece carved its legacy not in the thunder of conquest, but in the gentle permanence of art and story. The Stoa was one of the architectural gifts of Athens, a structure as utilitarian as it was symbolic. Long, rectangular, with open colonnades on one or more sides, stoas were spaces for movement and for thought. Merchants might pass through selling woven cloth, wine, or amphorae of oil. Philosophers would linger, leaning on columns, exchanging observations about the soul or the state. And citizens, from barefoot boys to grey-bearded strategoi, might walk silently beneath its paintings, absorbing the myths that had shaped them all. But Stoa Poikile, in particular, carried a unique weight. It was no mere walkway. On its walls, famed painters like Polygnotus, Mycon, and Paninus gave Athens a visual chronicle of her most treasured legends and victories. These were not simply decorative. They were memory rendered in pigment. The Amazonomachy, in which the Greeks battled the fierce matriarchal warriors from the east. The fall of Troy, where cunning and grief walked hand in hand. The Battle of Marathon, recently fought, freshly mourned, and deeply revered. A moment in time already passing into eternity. And there was Heracles, his labours immortalized in stillness. Art in Athens was never isolated from life. These murals weren't distractions from philosophy. They were part of it. For here, in the heart of the agora, within view of the courts, the shrines and the stoas of scholars, myth and reason cohabited. A painted scene of divine punishment might spark a discussion on justice. A heroic struggle could lead to questions about the nature of virtue. These images, vivid and haunting, spoke in a language both older and more fluid than words. And if the Stoa offered one kind of vision, painted, static, public, there was another kind of vision that hummed beneath the surface of the Greek world, one that came not from wall to eye, but from the earth to the soul. The oracles. The philosopher seated at the edge of the painted Stoa, eyes closed in thought, might have remembered or imagined the long and sacred roads that wound toward Delphi, toward Dodona, toward Claros, places where gods did not appear in brushstrokes or marble, but in riddles and murmurs, in signs coaxed from smoke, wind, and sacred springs. In Delphi, they said, the omphalos stone marked the center of the world. There, high on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, the temple of Apollo stood, its columns wrapped in laurel. Within it, the Pythia, Apollo's priestess, would sit upon a tripod above a chasm, breathing in vapors that rose from the earth. It was said that in this trance, she became the voice of the god himself. But hers was no simple speech. The oracles spoke in riddles, in fragments of verse or strange turns of phrase. A general might come seeking guidance for war and receive this: if you cross the river, a great empire will fall. The answer was clear only in retrospect. Which empire? Whose victory? There was mystery here, yes, but also an invitation to interpret, to think, to listen to the voice within as much as the voice without. The Greeks did not demand certainty from their gods. They welcomed ambiguity and the work it asked of the mind. Elsewhere, the oracle of Dodona spoke through rustling leaves. There, under ancient oaks sacred to Zeus, bronze tripods chimed in the breeze. Priests and priestesses listened to the sounds, the patterns, the movements. The divine did not need to appear in fire or stone. It was in the trembling of nature itself. This was a culture that revered not only reason, but the limits of reason. The painted heroes of the Stoa had encountered gods, beasts, and destinies that logic alone could not tame. Heracles, after all, could not have conquered madness by thought alone. Theseus could not have navigated the labyrinth without the thread of love, of intuition. And so, even the philosophers, those men of logos and dialectic, walked with myth in their shadow. Socrates at his trial spoke of a divine voice that guided him, a daimonion that warned, whispered, withheld. Not reason, not emotion, something else, something older. There is a kind of wisdom that comes not from books or scrolls, but from the silence between questions, from the breath held before a choice, from the way a painted lion looks at you from the wall, and you wonder what it would mean to face your own darkness with bare hands. In the agora, logic built democracies. In Delphi, riddles shaped history. Back under the colonnade, the sun had shifted. The light through the Stoa's open side fell in brighter slants now, cutting diagonals across the painted battles. The philosophers had drifted further down, gathering in a cluster of quiet discussion. The merchants had opened their stalls anew, and the scent of olive oil mingled with the dust. And somewhere, in a cave far from here perhaps, or in the curling trail of incense from a shrine, someone was asking the gods a question. The city slowly dissolved behind him. The murmurs of the agora faded into the measured hush of open land. Not silence, but a different music. The dry chatter of cicadas, the flutter of a lizard vanishing under stone, the soft whisper of olive branches stirring above an ancient path. It was the kind of walk a philosopher might take when thoughts grew too loud, when the stoer's echoing voices no longer brought clarity but clamour. Here, just beyond the limits of the city walls, the land became rhythm again. The slopes were gentler, the air warmer, and the dust, sunlit, clung to his sandals like memory. The olive trees stretched in long, irregular rows, their gnarled trunks twisted by centuries of wind. Some had stood there longer than the agora stones. Their bark bore the marks of pruning and harvesting, of hands old and young. Each knot and furrow was its own kind of writing, not in ink, but in weather and time. A shepherd passed slowly ahead, a crooked staff in one hand, a low whistle carrying over the bleats of his flock. He nodded without breaking pace, the easy courtesy of a shared path. The sheep moved like a cloud of wool and dust, indifferent to politics or poetry, guided only by shade, grass, and the shape of the road. This trail, winding just past the city's edge, was used by many. Farmers taking goods to market, children wandering after chores, priests seeking solitude, philosophers searching for that brief, pure alignment between self and world. The city, after all, was a place of ideals, but the land was where ideals had to stand on their own or fall quietly into dust. An old stone bench appeared beneath one of the taller olives, the kind of place where a conversation might have unfolded 100 times before, about virtue, perhaps, or the soul, or which local family made the finest olive oil in all Attica. He sat, hands resting on his knees, breathing the scent of resin and old bark. A cicada rasped near his shoulder, unbothered by his stillness. The olive tree, Elia, sacred to Athena, was no mere crop. It was city and spirit intertwined. According to myth, when Athena and Poseidon competed for the patronage of Athens, Poseidon struck the Acropolis with his trident and brought forth a salt spring. But Athena planted the olive, a tree that gave shade, wood, oil, and food, a gift of peace, patience, and practical wisdom. The Athenians chose her, and the city bore her name ever after. Even now, as he sat beneath her trees, he felt the slow gravity of that myth. It wasn't the kind that asked for belief in the literal. Rather, it unfolded like a parable. In the choice between thunder and seed, between sudden force and quiet offering, the Athenians had chosen what could grow. Wisdom, not war. Or at least they had tried. He reached into his satchel and withdrew a small crust of bread and a fig, letting the sweetness fill his mouth while the olive leaves danced in patterns of gold and green above him. The figs here, he knew, were grown in the plains towards Eleusis, the same region that hosted the great mysteries, those secret rites in honor of Demeter and Persephone. There, too, was a grove of sacred olives. Everything in time, connected. A boy emerged along the path, bare-legged, carrying a bundle of kindling. He paused, looking at the seated man. "Sir," he said, "are you a teacher?" "Sometimes," the man answered. "Do you teach under trees?" He smiled. "That is the best place to do it." The boy nodded, as if this confirmed something he had hoped, then continued on. The sound of his footsteps faded. Shadows lengthened, and a small wind brushed across the trail. Above, the olives rustled again, not in words, but in something older. The same wind had stirred these branches when Herodotus walked, when Socrates lingered here, when nameless men and women had paused beneath the same boughs for centuries before and after. Out here, Athens breathed more slowly. The crowds and debate of the city softened into wind and slope. and the land spoke in the voice of the ordinary, in flocks and footsteps, in groves and grain, in the labor of hands and the patience of trees. A voice once said that the olive tree has no flame, but its fire is slow and enduring. The oil it yields burns long into the night, feeding light that asks nothing in return. In the philosophy of the Stoics, the olive might be the perfect metaphor for the soul in harmony with nature, shaped by hardship, bent but not broken, rooted in the earth yet stretching toward the sun. The city may craft its laws and syllogisms, but the land reminds us to grow is to endure, to give is to live. Beneath olive branches, a man may forget the noise of the crowd. He may feel for a moment what it means to simply be. Beneath the Athenian sun, amidst a terrain often too rocky and dry for crops of indulgence, there flourished a tree of quiet resilience. The olive, Elaia in the ancient tongue, was no mere agricultural staple. It was the root of economy, ritual, medicine, and myth. To understand the olive in ancient Athens is to understand something vital about the Athenians themselves, their balance of pragmatism and reverence, of endurance and beauty. The myth tells us that the olive was a divine gift. When Athena and Poseidon competed for dominion over the region of Attica, Zeus declared that each should offer a gift to the city. Poseidon struck the rock of the Acropolis and summoned a saltwater spring, dramatic but briny and useless. Athena, in contrast, planted the first olive tree. It sprouted instantly, its silver-green leaves rustling in the sun, its fruit abundant. It was a gift of sustenance, fuel, shade, and trade. The Athenians chose Athena, and their city bore her name ever since. Her olive tree, they believed, continued to grow on the Acropolis, protected within the Erechtheian temple. Even after the Persian sack of Athens in 480 BCE, Herodotus writes that the sacred tree sprouted anew the very next day, a symbol of divine resilience. The olive tree thrived where wheat often struggled, in the rocky hillsides and poor soils of Attica. Its roots ran deep, its needs modest. Olive cultivation was a long-term investment. Trees took over a decade to yield significant fruit, but once matured, they could live and produce for hundreds of years. Athenians organized groves carefully. Many were state-controlled, especially those tied to temples or near sacred sites. Others were owned by aristocratic families and passed down generations. The olive became not only a symbol of civic pride, but also of inheritance, continuity, and lawful order. To illegally damage an olive tree in Athens was considered a crime, sometimes punishable by exile. The revered Moriae, sacred olive trees descended from Athena's original, were counted and monitored by officials called epimeletai. The olive harvest came in late autumn to early winter. Families and hired laborers would gather beneath the trees, laying out cloths and nets to catch the fruit. Olives were hand-picked or knocked down with long sticks, a careful task, since damage to branches could harm next year's yield. The fruit varied, some cultivated for oil, others for eating. Table olives were soaked, fermented, and preserved in brine. But the majority of the harvest was destined to become oil, the lifeblood of the Athenian home and market. The process of turning olives into oil was laborious and sacred in its own way. Crushing. Olives were first crushed in large stone mills, often using a circular grindstone rotated by animals or manual labor. This turned the fruit into a thick paste. Pressing. The paste was then transferred to woven baskets and placed under heavy wooden or stone presses. The first pressing, called proton eleion, was of the highest quality and often reserved for perfumes or sacred use. Settling. The oil was collected in large ceramic vessels and left to sit, allowing solids and water to settle. The top layer, pure and golden, was carefully siphoned off. Storage. Olive oil was stored in amphorae, sealed with clay or wax, and kept cool. These containers were often stamped with official marks, especially if destined for trade. The Athenian reliance on olive oil cannot be overstated. It permeated nearly every sphere of daily life. Food. Olive oil was used for cooking, dressing, and preserving. Bread was dipped in oil, vegetables were sautéed in it. Even sweets like honeyed cakes used oil in their preparation. Light. Oil lamps were the main source of light in homes and temples. A small clay lamp with a wick soaked in oil burned softly through the night, a flame that connected hearth, home, and memory, body and bath. Athletes anointed themselves with oil before and after exercise. The oil was then scraped off with a strigil, removing dirt and sweat. It was also used in massage, hygiene, and even as a base for scented perfumes. Medicine. Olive oil was believed to have healing properties. It soothed burns, wounds, and dry skin. Mixed with herbs, it became a poultice or salve. Religion and ritual. Oil was offered at altars, used to anoint statues of the gods, and burned in sacred lamps. In the Panathenaic festival, winners of athletic contests were awarded amphorae full of sacred olive oil, valuable both economically and spiritually. Olive oil was a cornerstone of Athenian trade. Surplus oil, especially from state groves, was exported across the Mediterranean to Egypt, Phoenicia, and the Italian peninsula. Amphorae found as far away as southern France and Crimea bear witness to the reach of this golden commodity. Its value was such that entire estates could be assessed by the yield of their olive trees. Olive oil wasn't just a product, it was currency, prestige, and promise. In the quiet groves outside the city, a philosopher might sit beneath a broad olive and find a kind of truth. That endurance, like virtue, grows slowly, that utility and beauty can coexist, that the fruits of labour, though long in the making, offer nourishment to both body and soul. To walk among olive trees in Athens was to move through myth and memory, through economy and piety. It was to be reminded that some gifts are not thunderous or sudden, but subtle, growing year by year, roots deep, branches open to the sky. They paused beneath an ancient tree whose bark held the texture of time itself, cracked, silvered, and wise. The branches arched above like a shrine's rafters, and light dappled through its narrow leaves, falling in slow rhythms onto the earth. The cicadas chanted softly. The olive grove, so near to the boundaries of the city, yet deep in its own stillness, felt as though it held secrets spoken in forgotten dialects. Two figures sat with their backs to the gnarled trunk, one older, in robes the colour of dusted stone, the other younger, sandals kicked off, holding a sun-warmed olive in hand. "Is it true," the younger asked, "that this was Athena's gift to us? That all this, the groves, the oil, the light, began with one tree?" The sound of bare feet slapping against packed earth drifted up from the gymnasium below. Dust stirred in slow spirals, kicked up by the sprinting bodies of young men circling the track. They ran like a tide, rising and ebbing in rhythm, their shoulders glinting with sweat, their limbs honed into elegant lines by repetition and effort. Above, on a low bench built into the colonnade's shadow, two figures watched in silence. One was old, draped in a worn hymation that caught the breeze like a pale wing. His beard was trimmed close, and his eyes, though softened by age, were sharp, alert beneath the line of his brow. Beside him sat a youth, just beyond boyhood, with the flush of exertion still on his cheeks and a laurel crown resting loosely in his hair. They had finished training. Now came the other practice. "They move like panthers," the youth said, gazing at the runners. The older man gave a slight nod. "Yes, but it is not the movement of the limbs that makes one strong. It is the harmony between the body and the will. Tell me, what is strength?" The youth was quiet for a moment, thoughtful. "To endure what others cannot," he answered. "To lift what weighs down the world." "Endurance," the elder repeated, "is part of it. So is force. But they alone do not build arete, virtue. Strength is a seed. It must be cultivated by reason. Otherwise it is only violence dressed in grace." The youth frowned slightly. But what of the games? The pancration, the javelin, the races, aren't these measures of a man's excellence? They are, the philosopher said gently, but only in part. A body that wins the race may still lose itself to hubris. True virtue is not measured only in the stadium, but in the agora, the household, the soul. The man who governs his anger in an argument, he too is an athlete. The woman who returns honesty in trade, even when deception would profit her, she is strong. These are also trials. From below, a trainer's voice rang out deep and sharp, calling for discipline. One of the runners stumbled but caught himself, gritting his teeth. The elder gestured toward the boy. You train your body here. Good. The gods favor a vessel that does not collapse under strain. But let your mind be trained also, in patience, in thought, in listening. And what of courage? The youth asked, his voice lower now. Is it not also a rite to stand firm in battle? The philosopher's gaze was distant for a moment. Courage, yes. But not the kind that rushes blindly toward the spear. That is recklessness. Courage is the knowledge of fear and the refusal to let it command you, to act in wisdom, not in rage. Even Achilles, mighty as he was undone not by weakness of body, but by the fire of his pride. They sat for a while in silence, the sounds of the gymnasium drifting like birdsong in and out of the air. A young man passed nearby carrying a discus. His footsteps echoed off the marble, then vanished. The philosopher leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees. Do you know the name of this place? He asked. The gymnasium? The elder smiled. Yes, but the word has deeper meaning. It comes from gymnos, naked, because here nothing is hidden. The body is trained in full view, but so too should the soul be, without shame, without deceit. The ancients built these places not just for competition, but for conversation, for music, for mathematics, for philosophy. So it is a school. It is a cradle, the old man said, for the city's soul. A warm breeze passed through the columns. Far off, the distant clatter of bronze told of another contest beginning. The sun crept across the white stone with slow deliberation, casting long lines of shadow from the fluted pillars. When do I know, the youth asked suddenly, if I have become virtuous? The philosopher smiled, not unkindly. When you no longer need to ask the question. The youth sat back against the stone, silent. The philosopher placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. The path is long, my son, but it begins each day you choose thought over impulse, patience over glory, justice over gain. These are the stones that make a city strong and a soul unshakable. They rose together. The training below was winding down, bodies now walking, laughing, cooling in shade. A few stopped to greet the elder, offering short, respectful nods. He returned them with quiet gravity. They walked together back toward the baths, where cold water waited to ease sore limbs and minds filled with heat. But even as they left, the sound of the gymnasium remained behind them like a chorus, footfalls and breath, the cadence of striving and the ever-turning pursuit of virtue. In the quiet, before the midday sun pressed heavy on the city, the gymnasium rested like a coiled breath. Long colonnades shaded its edges. Sandaled feet had worn smooth the stones of its pathways. Here, in this space between exertion and reflection, Athenian life breathed its fuller rhythm. The word gymnasium comes from the Greek gymnos, naked. It was a place where the body, exposed and disciplined, met with the mind, equally laid bare in dialogue and learning. But far from being only a space for physical training, the gymnasium was a cornerstone of Greek civic identity. It was temple, school, and sanctuary. 3 major gymnasia were famed in Athens: the Academy, the Lyceum, and the Cynosarges. Each of them bore a different flavor, a different intellectual lineage. The Academy, just northwest of the city walls, was sacred to Athena and to the hero Academos, from whom its name was drawn. It was here that Plato established his philosophical school, a grove of olive trees and a place of inquiry where geometry and dialectic mixed freely with myth and politics. The Lyceum, further east near the banks of the Ilissos River, was sacred to Apollo Lycaeus. Here Aristotle walked and taught. His school, the Peripatetic, derived its name from the act of walking, for Aristotle and his students would move beneath the colonnades, conversing as they strolled, exchanging questions and observations like passing coins. The third, cynossages, lay just outside the walls and was known as the gymnasium of those born of mixed parentage, citizens not fully citizen. It was here that Antisthenes, the student of Socrates, would teach the early tenets of cynicism, a life stripped of luxury, focused on virtue alone. But more than just their individual reputations, gymnasia served as the civic hearth of Athenian male culture. Boys and young men trained for athletics, for war, for citizenship. They learned not just to run, wrestle and throw, but to speak with clarity, to listen with patience, and to argue with respect. To walk the sanded track was to rehearse for the battlefield. To sit beneath the fig trees discussing ethics was to rehearse for the agora. The gymnasium trained the whole person, body, soma, soul, suche, and intellect, nous. Physical exercises were rigorous: wrestling, pale, boxing, pygmy, javelin, akon, discus, discos, running, stadion, and the grueling combination known as the pancration, which bordered on the raw edge of combat. Athletes trained nude, their bodies oiled to highlight muscle and form. The oiled skin also protected against sun and wind, and after training, a curved tool called a strigil was used to scrape away the mixture of dust, oil, and sweat, a ritual that marked the end of discipline. But alongside these, the young men engaged in musical education, learning to play the lyre, to recite Homer, to understand the pulse of poetry. Music, the Greeks believed, trained the soul to move in harmony, as gymnastics trained the body. The gymnasium also held rooms for lectures, baths for cleansing, altars for sacrifice, and shrines to the gods. It was a sacred place, and those who trained or taught within it did so not only for self-improvement, but for the strength of the polis, the city-state, the collective soul. In the afternoons, once training concluded and the air cooled, philosophers often gathered in shaded porticos. Socrates, too poor to teach in formal schools, often wandered the gymnasia, posing questions to athletes, soldiers, and scholars alike. His dialectic, the elenchus or refutation, shaped the moral language of a generation. It was here that he asked, "What is justice, and can virtue be taught?" And here that Plato overheard, listened, and would later build an academy in his master's honor. The gymnasium was also a political training ground. Here, boys were taught rhetoric, the art of persuasion, vital in a democracy where every citizen could speak in the assembly. To speak well was to wield power. To think clearly was to defend the city without drawing a sword. Even the gods of the gymnasium reflected its values. Apollo, god of light, healing, and music, was its patron. Heracles, symbol of endurance and strength. Hermes, of swift motion and cunning mind. The Muses, who whispered memory and invention. Olive trees, sacred to Athena, grew along the paths and in the courtyards. Their oil was used to anoint athletes and to light the oil lamps at night. Athenian olive oil was famous throughout the Greek world, stored in amphorae bearing images of the goddess and awarded as prizes in athletic festivals. To sit on a bench under a pergola of vines and listen to a philosopher compare the soul to a charioteer, reason holding the reins of passion and appetite, was to partake in a tradition as old as the city itself. Athens taught that the ideal man was a blend of strength and thought, a living harmony of opposites. He should run swiftly and speak wisely, wrestle honorably and judge fairly, be brave in battle and humble in discourse. The gymnasium was his crucible, and though time has worn away the painted walls and scattered the students' footsteps into dust, echoes of their conversations still live, in books, in memory, in the shapes of our words. For from the gymnasium came not only Olympians but orators, citizens, thinkers, those who built the pillars of the Western mind. Here, where sweat met syllable, a city's soul was shaped. The dust of the palestra had settled for the day, and the sun, pale and golden, slanted between the colonnades of the gymnasium. The sounds of wrestling had quieted, replaced by the soft scrape of sandals, the hum of cicadas, and the rhythmic clink of a strigil cleaned with water. An older man sat on a stone bench beside a fig tree, its leaves wide and still. He wore a simple tunic, and in his hands was a smooth branch of olive wood he'd been whittling into a walking stick. Across from him sat a youth, no more than 16, his curls still wet from the bathhouse, his shoulders sore from the morning's pancreation. They had spoken before, but only in passing. Today, the older man had watched the boy wrestle, not for strength or speed, but for how he listened. The silence between them stretched like linen drying in the sun. Then the man spoke. "Tell me," he said, "when you struggle, do you struggle against your opponent or against yourself?" The youth blinked. He looked at his hands, calloused now from weeks of training, then back to the man. "At first it was him," he said, "but today I think it was me." The old man smiled faintly. "Then you are learning?" The youth hesitated. "But what am I learning?" The man gestured to the column beside them. "A stone pillar holds weight because it stands straight, but also because it was shaped by many hands. Thought is like this. The city shapes us. So does our training. So do our questions." He looked toward the olive grove beyond the gymnasium wall, where shadows were beginning to lengthen. "I once asked my teacher what the soul was made of. He told me, desire, anger, and reason, like 3 horses pulling a chariot." He chuckled. "I've spent my life trying to hold the reins." The youth tilted his head. "And have you?" The old man's eyes gleamed. "Only on calm days." A breeze passed between them, carrying the faint scent of oil and clay. Somewhere nearby a lyre was being tuned, a few soft notes climbing like birds into the warm air. The youth, silent now, watched the leaves above him shift and settle. And in that moment, something passed between them. Not an answer, but an invitation to keep asking. The sun had climbed to its zenith, high and unsparing, burning the white walls of Athens into brilliance. The city had gone quiet. Stalls in the agora were shuttered or drawn back into shadow, the clatter of sandals and chatter of debate stilled. Even the doves that clung to the rooftops cooed more softly, their wings tucked to their sides. It was the hour when the body demanded rest and the mind turned inward, retreating to cooler thoughts and shade. Beneath a grove of fig trees on the southern slope of the Areopagus, several figures lay in partial repose, stretched on blankets or seated on low stone benches. The shade there was dense enough to hold back the fire of the sun, and a breeze climbed from the direction of the sea, just enough to rustle leaves and lift the edges of thin cloaks. One man, older, leaned back against a cracked column that had fallen in some past tremor. He held a ceramic cup of watered wine in both hands, the clay cool against his skin. The younger companions with him, students mostly, or travelling thinkers drawn in from Delos and Corinth, passed around bunches of dried figs, almonds, and soft cheese wrapped in grape leaves. They spoke little, as though words might crack the stillness of the air. A young woman, known to the group as Thaleia, set down her cup and leaned into the crook of her elbow. "Tell us something," she murmured. "Something soft, something to drift with, like this eat." Her eyes were half closed, her limbs loose from wine and warmth. The older man smiled. He looked up into the net of branches overhead, speckled with green globes of ripening fruit. The sunlight fell through like honey. "Let me tell you what I once heard in the garden of Epicurus," he said quietly. "Not long ago, just across the city, where the olive trees lean low and the walls are humble." He let his voice soften, draw out gently like a breeze through reeds. Epicurus did not build his school upon marble steps or within colonnaded halls. He taught from a small garden, enclosed and flowering, where the perfume of herbs sweetened the air and every voice could be heard without echo. There the philosopher would say, "Do not fear the gods, for they dwell far and do not trouble themselves with our trifles. Do not fear death, for where it is you are not, and where you are it is not. And above all, Seek pleasure not of the flesh alone, but of the soul's ease. Talea opened one eye and asked, "But what kind of pleasure?" "Freedom from pain, the kind that needs no gold to buy it. The relief of thirst quenched, the joy of a kind word, the peace of knowing you need nothing more than what you already have." Another youth added, "And yet the Stoics would tell us to expect hardship, to welcome it." The old man nodded. "Yes, to the Stoics, virtue is not the absence of pain, but the strength to meet it. They believe in the Logos, the divine reason pervading all things. One must align with it, even when the world brings suffering." He looked at his calloused hands, flecked with red from the wine. One garden speaks of ease, the other of endurance, but both teach us how to dwell in our skin. A long pause followed. The fig leaves above them whispered their own slow rhythm. From the hills came the dry sound of cicadas, endless and unhurried. Beneath their song, the silence returned, not the silence of absence, but the full silence, warm and humming with being. Someone exhaled and adjusted a sandal. A few bees wandered through, uncertain if the group was plant or shade. Down the hill they could hear a shepherd's flute, a faint tune wafting with the rising air. And above, the Acropolis remained unmoved, gleaming in the haze like the prow of some eternal ship sailing through sky. The old man reached for a fig and bit into it. The juice clung to his fingers, sweet and sticky. He said, "You know, in this hour even thoughts grow slower, but not lesser. There is clarity in slowness, like wine settling, like dust finding stillness." "Perhaps," said one of the others, "truth lives in the stillest part of the day." The group chuckled softly, not because the remark was funny, but because it was true in a way they could not yet explain. Talea, now fully reclined, had begun to drift. Her breath was even, her limbs loose. In her light doze, she dreamed of walking barefoot through olive groves where the trees whispered names in ancient tongues, names of winds, of lost cities, of stars that had no constellation. In her dream she asked one of the trees, "What is the soul made of?" The tree did not speak in words, but gave her a feeling of cool earth, of water just beneath the roots, of something growing without needing to be seen. She stirred gently, her hand curling around the stem of her cup. The sun had shifted slightly now, tracing its slow arc toward the west. The worst of its fury had passed, but it still shimmered above the white walls of the city. One by one, the students roused themselves. They stood, stretched, brushed off the dust from their cloaks and sandals. Some walked down toward the well to splash their faces. Others climbed the low wall and looked out toward the plain, where olive trees stretched like a green tide toward the distant sea. The old man remained seated, eyes closed. He was not asleep, only listening, to the sound of breath, of sun on skin, of silence unbroken. And in that quiet, Athens itself seemed to exhale. In the old rhythm of ancient Athens, time moved not in hours marked by the toll of clocks, but in the changing weight of sunlight. The city, alive with voices and commerce in the early morning, quieted with the rise of the sun to its peak. Midday was not a moment of rush, but a soft retreat, a silence preserved in the stones of ruined agoras and shaded courtyards. This pause was more than habit, it was embedded in the Athenian way of life. By the 6th hour of daylight, what we would now consider noon, the bustle of the agora would slow. Market sellers packed their wares or withdrew into shadows under canvas sheets. Public business, court proceedings, and philosophical debate gave way to private rhythms. The intense Mediterranean sun could be unrelenting. The stones of the city radiated it back like hearth embers. Athenians knew to seek refuge during this time. Most households arranged the day accordingly. Meals were simple: bread softened in oil, figs, olives, a splash of wine diluted with water. In wealthier homes, courtyards held shade and fountains. In humbler dwellings, a tree or overhanging awning might suffice. Labourers might sleep on rolled mats, artisans on benches or shaded stoops. This rest, sometimes referred to in later Roman times as meridiatio, wasn't laziness, but an allowance for balance. In philosophy too, this rhythm was mirrored. The pursuit of wisdom was not a frantic quest, but a measured walk. The midday pause became a fitting metaphor for contemplation itself, a breath between actions. Southwest of the Dipylon Gate, just beyond the formal chaos of the inner city, there stood a quiet place unlike the academies of Plato or the colonnades of the Stoics. This was the garden of Epicurus, a humble walled grove filled with herbs, fruit trees, and walking paths. Epicurus, born on the island of Samos around 341 BCE, had little interest in establishing a school of grandeur. His pursuit was not glory, but tranquility. He taught that philosophy should heal the soul like medicine, freeing people from needless fear, especially the fear of gods and death. To Epicurus, the universe was composed of atoms and void. The gods, if they existed, lived serenely beyond our world and bore no interest in human affairs. Death was a dispersal of atoms, nothing more, and thus not to be feared. And so he cultivated a life of moderation. Unlike those who craved power or prestige, Epicurus advocated for simple pleasures: a meal with friends, shade on a hot day, the absence of physical pain and mental distress. The Greek term ataraxia, freedom from disturbance, was his goal. He welcomed women and slaves into his circle, an unusual practice among philosophical schools. They walked and talked among the rosemary, sat beneath fig trees, and explored ideas not in pursuit of argument, but in search of peace. One of Epicurus's most enduring teachings was this: if you wish to be rich, do not add to your money, but subtract from your desires. In the heat of the Athenian noon, such words found deep resonance. Food at midday was sparse but meaningful. The Athenians were not gluttons. In the garden of Epicurus, the meal might consist of barley bread, a few olives, goat cheese, and a cup of water or wine, often drunk crassi, diluted, never strong. In his letters, Epicurus once wrote, "Send me a little pot of cheese, so that when I wish to live luxuriously, I may do so." This quiet defiance of extravagance was not a denial of joy, but a redefinition of it. He taught that desiring only what was truly necessary freed one from the endless chase of insatiable wants. It was not wealth, but contentment that made one rich. The midday pause was also a moment for inner tending. Just as the sun scorched the earth, the heart could become arid without rest. Many Greeks, not only Epicureans, took these hours for reflection, prayer, or dreams. It was believed that dreams during this time, brief and half-waking, could carry messages from the self or even from beyond. Lying beneath fig trees or olive branches, Athenians sometimes recorded dreams, believing them to hold omens or insights. In the Asclepiaea, healing temples scattered across Greece, patients would undergo incubation, sleeping in sacred stillness to receive divine guidance. Such practices mirrored the inner journeys of philosophy itself. The midday hour was not merely for the body, but for the soul to wander. The ancients believed that the cicada, endlessly singing under the sun, was a symbol of resurrection and poetic clarity. In Plato's Phaedrus, Socrates sits beneath a tree during midday, speaking of love and beauty, while cicadas sing overhead. He remarks that the cicadas were once men, so entranced by the muses that they forgot to eat or sleep, and so died, transformed by the gods into creatures of eternal song. And so, in the heat of the day, Athenians, philosophers, poets, and labourers alike, listened, not only to the insects, but to the slowing of time, the gentling of thought. He welcomed women and slaves into his circle, an unusual practice among philosophical schools. They walked and talked among the rosemary, sat beneath fig trees and explored ideas not in pursuit of argument, but in search of peace. One of Epicurus's most enduring teachings was this: if you wish to be rich, do not add to your money, but subtract from your desires. In the heat of the Athenian noon, such words found deep resonance. Food at midday was sparse but meaningful. The Athenians were not gluttons. In the garden of Epicurus, the meal might consist of barley bread, a few olives, goat cheese, and a cup of water or wine, often drunk crasi, diluted, never strong. In his letters, Epicurus once wrote, "Send me a little pot of cheese, so that when I wish to live luxuriously I may do so." This quiet defiance of extravagance was not a denial of joy, but a redefinition of it. He taught that desiring only what was truly necessary freed one from the endless chase of insatiable wants. It was not wealth, but contentment that made one rich. The midday pause was also a moment for inner tending. Just as the sun scorched the earth, the heart could become arid without rest. Many Greeks, not only Epicureans, took these hours for reflection, prayer, or dreams. It was believed that dreams during this time, brief and half-waking, could carry messages from the self, or even from beyond. Lying beneath fig trees or olive branches, Athenians sometimes recorded dreams, believing them to hold omens or insights. In the Asclepiaea, healing temples scattered across Greece, patients would undergo incubation, sleeping in sacred stillness to receive divine guidance. Such practices mirrored the inner journeys of philosophy itself. The midday hour was not merely for the body, but for the soul to wander. The ancients believed that the cicada, endlessly singing under the sun, was a symbol of resurrection and poetic clarity. In Plato's Phaedrus, Socrates sits beneath a tree during midday, speaking of love and beauty while cicadas sing overhead. He remarks that the cicadas were once men, so entranced by the muses that they forgot to eat or sleep, and so died, transformed by the gods into creatures of eternal song. And so, in the heat of the day, Athenians, philosophers, poets, and laborers alike, listened, not only to the insects, but to the slowing of time, the gentling of thought. Today, beneath the ruins of Athens, fig trees still grow. Their leaves shimmer, their shade clings to old stones, and in the silence of midday you can almost hear the hum of a lost age. To rest, to reflect, to savor a simple cup. These were not moments stolen from productivity, but rites of balance. In the rhythm of the ancient Greek day, the heat of the sun did not hinder thought. It shaped it. It required a stillness from which clarity could rise. And in a garden outside the city, where words wandered and desires grew small, a man named Epicurus once whispered that happiness was not something chaste, but something quietly tended. Just like a tree, the fire had long since settled to embers, and the cicadas had grown silent. In the distance, only the occasional breath of wind stirred the branches of the trees, their leaves whispering in the hush of night. Somewhere close, a flute had played earlier, faint, lilting, then gone. The night was full and still. A boy lay beside his teacher on a rolled woolen cloak. They had walked far that day, they had spoken much, but now the time for words had passed, or nearly. "Master," the boy whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. The old man turned slightly, not lifting his head. "Hmm? What happens?" the boy asked. "When the soul leaves the body." The old man was quiet for some time. Then, in a voice as smooth and low as a river under stone, he began to speak, not as teacher to student, but as one soul remembering something another had once forgotten. "Long ago," he said, "before the world had settled into its present form, the soul lived among the stars. Not as we see them now, no, not dots of fire in the heavens, but as points of memory. The soul was whole then, round, like the sphere that rolls smooth across marble. It had no hunger, no pain, only harmony. It moved with other souls in spirals, not through space, but through meaning. It sang in silent tones." The boy listened, wide-eyed in the dark. "But something happened," the old man went on. as it always does in these stories. The soul was drawn downward, whether by curiosity or longing or a whisper from Gaia herself, none can say. And so it fell, not through the air, but through time and forgetting. It entered the world through a breath, or a cry, or perhaps through the glimmer of a thought. He paused, as if listening to something only he could hear. It was clothed in flesh. It woke to the world through the eyes of a child. And in that moment, it forgot where it had come from. It forgot the harmony of the stars. But not entirely. No, a trace remained, in dreams, in music, in the deep stirrings of love and awe. The soul carried a longing it could not name. The boy, silent, was no longer sleepy. Some say, the teacher continued, that the soul journeys through many lives, that it passes through the forms of all living things, fish, bird, woman, man, that it gathers knowledge as it goes, like a bee collecting nectar from many fields. This is what the Orphics teach, that each life is a lesson, and the soul must return until it remembers the whole of its true song. And when it remembers? The boy asked. Then, the old man said softly, it rises. It returns not to a place, but to a state, a harmony beyond the reach of pain or fear. The soul joins again the music of the cosmos. It becomes itself, fully and forever. He reached out and gently stirred the ashes of the fire with a twig. Plato told of a man named he said, who died on the battlefield and returned to tell the tale. He saw the souls choosing their next lives, some carefully, some carelessly. He saw those who had once been kings choosing to live as honest craftsmen, and those who had been beasts choosing to walk as philosophers. It was not punishment or reward, he said. It was consequence. The soul, like a river, flows toward what it loves. A long pause followed. Then, is it good to be a philosopher? The boy asked. It is good to seek truth, the old man answered. But truth is not a weapon, nor a prize. It is a remembering. The task of the philosopher is to awaken what the soul already knows. To learn is to recollect. The boy's eyes closed slowly. The teacher pulled the blanket over them both. Rest now, he said. The soul has long travels ahead, and this night is part of them. As the boy drifted into sleep, he dreamt of a path of stars beneath his feet, and voices not heard with the ears, and of a bird that flew from his chest and circled the moon. And the teacher lay still beside him, eyes open to the sky, watching the heavens wheel slowly on, as they always had, and always would. The philosophers of old did not simply teach, they reminded. In Athens, when words were exchanged beneath fig trees or in shaded porticos, the highest aim of dialogue was anamnesis, the soul's remembrance. For in the Platonic view, truth is not newly made, but uncovered, like a statue beneath the dust of centuries. All learning, said Socrates in the Phaedrus, is but recollection. And so the soul, fallen into body, listens for familiar echoes. It hears a certain kind of music, and weeps. It sees beauty in a gesture, and stirs. In sleep it glimpses shapes that no eye has seen, and yet they feel known. These are not tricks, but signals, hints from the soul's former dwelling place, veiled in the rhythms of waking life. To those who walked the Orphic path, the soul was more than breath or shadow. It was divine, a spark of the cosmos. When one died, a small tablet of gold, thin as a leaf, might be buried with them, bearing lines meant to guide the soul through the afterlife. One such tablet, unearthed from a grave in southern Italy, reads, "I am a child of earth and starry heaven, but my race is of heaven alone. This you yourselves know. I am parched with thirst and I perish. Give me to drink from the ever-flowing spring." These verses were instructions, passwords, and poetry all at once. They remind us that the soul has a lineage not from dust, but from the turning stars. The spring, often mentioned, is not of water only. It is the source of memory, Mnemosyne herself, the mother of the muses. To drink from her stream was to remember who you were before life clouded your sight. And so the philosopher seeks clarity, not to argue, not to dominate, but to remember. Each idea is a key, each conversation a return. In the still moments between footsteps or in the hush of heat just after noon, The ancient teachers believed the soul could speak. It speaks not in words, but in recognition, the way a scent can open a memory buried for years. In this way, even now, one might sit beneath the sky and listen. One might feel the self soften as if something behind the eyes recalls a forgotten name. And in that moment, brief as it is, the soul turns, like a ship catching the wind, and moves again toward home. There is a place between shadow and sunlight, a quiet, columned walk, an olive leaf spinning in still air, where a man once paused and asked, not, "What must I do?" but rather, "What is?" This question, simple and vast, was the beginning of philosophy. In the beginning there were no grand schools, no robed sages with marble busts, just men, mostly from the coasts of Ionia, Miletus, Ephesus, Samos, gazing at water, fire, stars. These were the pre-Socratics, thinkers who stood on the thresholds of temples and salt-washed cities and began to wonder aloud. Thales of Miletus, around 600 BCE, is said to have claimed that all is water, not in the sense of moisture or puddle, but that water was the primary substance, the root of all change and life. He predicted an eclipse, and some called him a magician. Others, a fool who once fell in a ditch for staring at the sky. His successor, Anaximander, thought differently. He spoke of the Apeiron, the boundless, a force with no form, no edge, no beginning. It gave birth to worlds. He drew one of the first maps. He asked not just what is the world made of, but how does it remain in balance? Soon came Heraclitus of Ephesus, wrapped in riddles like his smoky city. He said, "Everything flows, pantarei, and you cannot step into the same river twice." To Heraclitus, fire was the true nature of things, ever-changing, alive. The universe, he believed, was built not on stillness, but on tension, opposites locked in harmony, day and night, life and death, war and peace. Opposing him, quietly, was Parmenides of Elea. "Change is an illusion," he said. "There is only being, and it does not move." He closed the doors on the senses. Only reason, he claimed, could guide us to truth. All else was appearance. To follow his logic was to walk through fog, and yet his influence rippled like stone in still water. From these fragments of thought, preserved in quotes and scrolls, whispered down through students and scribes, philosophy grew roots. Then came Socrates, not with scrolls but with questions. He wandered the streets of Athens barefoot, stopping merchants, generals, slaves. "What is justice?" he asked. "What is courage? What is the good life?" He did not answer. He asked. His method was conversation, dialectic, a shared uncovering, peeling back assumptions like bark to find the living truth beneath. Socrates never wrote a word. His thoughts live in the dialogues of Plato, his student, and it is through Plato that we step into the academy, beneath shaded trees outside Athens, where ideas flowered like the fig trees near its paths. Plato believed in a realm of forms, ideal versions of everything, the perfect circle, the true chair, the essence of justice. What we see in the world, he said, are shadows on a cave wall. To know truth is to turn slowly and walk toward the light. In the Republic, he imagined a just city, ruled by philosopher kings educated through music, mathematics, and introspection. He traced the shape of the soul, reason, spirit, and desire. He placed harmony as the goal, in society, in thought, in the self. From Plato came Aristotle, more grounded, more observant. While Plato dreamed in metaphors, Aristotle built systems. He studied biology, poetry, ethics, politics. He invented logic as we know it, syllogism, premise, conclusion. To him, knowledge began in experience. Form and matter existed together. Everything had four causes: material, formal, efficient, and final. He sought not shadows but substance. In Aristotle's ethics, arete, virtue, came through habit. One became good by doing good. The mean between extremes, courage between rashness and cowardice, generosity between waste and greed, this was the golden path. A good life, he said, was one of contemplation, friendship, moderation, and above all, eudaimonia, flourishing. Even as the Lyceum's garden paths filled with his students' footsteps, new schools formed. There were the Stoics, who believed in the Logos, a rational order pervading the cosmos. Zeno of Citium taught from a painted stoa, a colonnade in Athens, that the wise must align with nature's order. Emotions were not to be erased but understood. What is beyond our control should not disturb us. Virtue alone is the good. Epictetus, later born a slave, would echo this. We cannot control events. We can only control our reactions. Opposing the Stoics gently were the Epicureans. Epicurus built a garden open to all, even women and slaves. He taught that pleasure, rightly understood, was the goal of life, not indulgence, but freedom from pain, from fear. Death, he said, is nothing to us. The gods do not meddle in our lives. What matters is friendship, quiet joy, a mind at peace. Elsewhere, the cynics abandoned convention entirely. Diogenes lived in a barrel, mocked power, and carried a lamp in daylight, looking for an honest man. He believed virtue required no possessions, no city, no flattery, only independence and truth. And then the skeptics, who questioned the very possibility of knowledge. Pyrrho, their early guide, taught suspension of judgment. Epoch. Peace, he said, comes when we stop clinging to opinions. Like ships loosed from moorings, our minds drift freer when not chained to certainty. All of these, Stoic, Epicurean, cynic, skeptic, arose in the same few centuries, like stars igniting at once in a night sky. They debated. They disagreed. Yet each sought the same thing, not wealth, not conquest, but wisdom. Philosophia, the love of it. Their words crossed seas, carved into stone, copied by monks, burned, recovered, retranslated. They were read in Alexandria, in Baghdad, in Constantinople, in Paris, in Kyoto. They passed into the hands of poets, jurists, generals. Some ideas vanished for centuries and returned. Others still sleep, waiting for a voice to speak them again. And now, in this quiet hour, whether read from a glowing screen or recited by firelight, their voices return. They remind us that thought is not a race, but a walk. That knowledge is not a ladder, but a garden. That the questions that stirred Athens 2,000 years ago, who am I? What is good? How should I live? Are still with us, soft as a breeze through olive branches. And perhaps that is the deepest truth. Not that we must find answers, but that we must keep asking. The air was quieter here, lifted by height and wind. The walk had risen slowly through shaded lanes, past scattered stone benches and dry grass, until the weight of the city below was replaced by the weight of history above. There it stood, the Acropolis. Not merely a high place, but the high place. A crown of pale marble set upon Athens' brow, glowing gold in the evening light, touched by centuries and silence. The philosopher stood still now, his feet planted in dust, his gaze tracing the sharp lines of columns against the vast fading sky. The Parthenon, temple of Athena, rose at the summit like a hymn made visible. Its fluted Doric columns stood in measured rhythm, as if echoing the steps of those who came before, priests, generals, sculptors, supplicants. And all around the breeze carried fragments, scents of time and old earth, echoes of sandals on stone, the rustle of tunics and the scratch of chisels. Even the city's noise seemed hushed here, softened by reverence. Athens, the polis, the koinonia, the community, breathed beneath it. Once not far from here, the philosopher had stood shoulder to shoulder in the assembly, debating war, grain, taxes and treaties. He had listened to voices swell like waves and sometimes crash into silence. Democracy, messy and brave, lived in the lungs of its people. Free men with calloused hands and sharp tongues. Here, all were meant to speak, to listen, to serve, and above it all the Acropolis watched, serene, unbending, a symbol both of order and of longing. But now, as the sun dropped low, it was not civic life but the gods who stirred memory. Athena, Pallas, Promachos, Parthenos, warrior, protector, goddess of wisdom. She was everywhere here, in the smooth folds of marble robes, in the spear-shaped leaves of the olive groves below, in the cool logic of debate and the silent strategy of chess. The great statue that once stood within the Parthenon, Phidias's towering Athena, was long gone, but in the mind's eye she lived still. Shield in one hand, winged Nike in the other. Gold, ivory, poise, She had watched over victories and defeats, plagues and plays. To invoke her name was to call upon balance between war and reason, courage and care. Why her? The youth had once asked when they paused beneath an olive tree. Why Athena, not Ares? Because Ares charges, the philosopher replied. But Athena chooses. There were other gods too, reminders carved into lintels and whispered in poetry. Poseidon, who had struck this rock and summoned salt from stone. Dionysus, whose theatre nestled below, had watched tragedies unfold like destinies. And Hephaestus, lame but skillful, whose forge of creation mirrored Athens itself, a city built not on bloodlines but on craft, dialogue and wit. Yet the gods were not rulers now. Their temples stood like open questions, not commands. The philosopher did not pray so much as ponder. He saw in Athena's calm gaze a mirror of his own search, for wisdom over impulse, for insight over power. The Parthenon itself, perfect in proportion, complex in simplicity, was more than a house for a deity. It was a statement, a challenge. Built after the Persian Wars, when Athens rose from ruin to glory, it declared to the world, we endure, we reason, we create. But glory is never weightless. He thought of Pericles, whose voice had once echoed here, stirring the city with his funeral oration, praising Athens as a school for Hellas, a light for all. And yet, even as he spoke, the plague crept into the city's crowded walls. Death does not bend to rhetoric. The gods, perhaps, had listened and said nothing. Even now, centuries on, the philosopher could feel that same fragility. Power built the Parthenon, but pride hollowed it. What begins in balance can end in hubris. And so the Acropolis, for all its height, whispered a warning too. A soft gust of wind stirred the hem of his robe. Below, twilight cloaked the agora, casting the city in long shadows and amber glints. Lamps were being lit. A boy chased after a runaway dog. A woman leaned from her window to pour water onto thirsty herbs. And still, the Parthenon stood, unmoved. Nearby, a few travellers gathered, quiet figures seated on worn stones. One plucked at a lyre. Another rubbed his sandals clean of dust. They spoke little. The view spoke for them. One man, older and wrapped in a pale cloak, pointed toward the city's edge. From up here, he said gently, all of it seems smaller, even the things we argue about. The philosopher nodded. Perhaps that is what the gods see, our noise, softened. Do they care? Some days I think yes. Other days I think they are listening, waiting to see if we figure it out ourselves. They sat in silence. Eventually someone quoted a line from Aeschylus. In our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom. The city shimmered now, not in heat but in memory. A city of thinkers, rebels, artists, lovers, builders, a city scarred and sacred, a city that asked more than it answered. And above it, Athena watched still. The sun dipped behind Mount Hymettus, its last light catching on white marble like a final breath before night. The cicadas began again, tireless. The columns of the Parthenon turned from gold to silver, then slowly to shadow. The philosopher stood, brushing dust from his hands. He would descend again, to hearths and sleeping courtyards, to fig trees and lanterns. But for now, in this breath of light and history, he understood something without needing to name it. Even gods live in silence sometimes, and wisdom often speaks not in thunder but in stone, enduring the centuries, still listening. The Acropolis was not built in haste, nor did it rise at a single command. It grew, from dust and ruin, from the minds of artisans and the hearts of citizens, from the memory of war and the promise of something higher. Before the gleam of marble, there was fire. In 480 BCE, the Persians burned Athens. The old temples atop the Acropolis were sacked, their statues broken, their altars defiled. Smoke rose above the sacred rock, and the heart of the city cracked. For a time it was left untouched, a solemn scar. The Athenians swore they would not rebuild until their vengeance was fulfilled. And yet from that ruin came one of the greatest architectural triumphs the world has ever known. It began under Pericles, statesman, orator, visionary. In the mid-5th century BCE, with Athens ascendant, wealthy and filled with ambition, he proposed a renewal not just of temples, but of identity. The city, he said, must reflect its soul. Its greatness must be made visible, its devotion to Athena eternalized in stone. Thus began the Periclean building program, with funds from the Delian League's treasury, controversially transferred to Athens. The Acropolis became a canvas. The Parthenon was its centerpiece. Designed by the architects Iktinos and Callicrates and overseen by the sculptor Phidias, the Parthenon was built between 447 and 432 BCE. Constructed almost entirely of Pentelic marble, quarried from nearby Mount Pentelicus, it shimmered with a golden hue. Every block was shaped with precision, each column subtly curved, each line intentionally softened to counteract optical illusion. It was a temple, yes, but also a monument, a treasury, a mirror of reason and power. Inside once stood Phidias's masterpiece, a massive statue of Athena Parthenos, over 12 meters tall, made of gold and ivory. She wore a helmet, held a shield and spear, and cradled Nike, the winged goddess of victory, in her palm. Her face was serene, unshaken by the battles of mortals. Around the temple, carvings came alive. The metopes depicted mythic battles, Greeks against centaurs, gods against giants, order against chaos. The frieze unusually portrayed a civic scene, the Panathenaic procession celebrating Athena's birthday. Citizens on horseback, maidens with offerings, elders in draped robes, all frozen in elegant relief, a tribute not just to gods but to Athens itself. To stand before the Parthenon, then, was to see the divine in the civic, the eternal in the present. But it was not alone. To the north stood the Erechtheion, stranger and more sacred still. Asymmetrical, built upon uneven ground, it was a shrine to the city's deepest myths. Here, they said, Athena and Poseidon once competed for patronage of Athens. Poseidon struck the rock with his trident, bringing forth salt water, or a war horse in some versions. Athena, more cunning, offered the olive tree, fruit-bearing, shade-giving, a symbol of peace and prosperity. The citizens chose her gift. And so the olive tree still grew beside the Erechtheion, gnarled and silvery, blessed by myth. The Erechtheion housed sacred relics, the mark of Poseidon's trident, the ancient wooden statue of Athena Polias, guardian of the city, the tomb of King Cecrops, half man, half snake. Its most famous feature was the porch of the Caryatids, 6 maiden statues supporting the roof, each graceful, weight-bearing, eternally poised. To the south, the temple of Athena Nike stood small and elegant, overlooking the sea road. Built around 427–424 BCE, it celebrated victory in battle, particularly against the Persians, but also embodied the Greek hope for peace. Its frieze showed gods and humans side by side, subtly reminding worshippers of the closeness between myth and reality. Beneath it all lay the theatre of Dionysus, carved into the slope. Here, the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and the comedies of Aristophanes were performed. The gods were praised above, but here below, their dramas unfolded. The jealousies of Hera, the rage of Achilles, the madness of Medea. Even the Propylaea, the grand entrance gate to the Acropolis, was a statement. It framed the ascent, slowing the steps of those who climbed, forcing them to notice, to honor. Passing through it was symbolic, from mundane life to sacred presence. And yet, for all its grandeur, the Acropolis was not aloof. It belonged to the people. Each year during the Panathenaea, the citizens of Athens would gather and ascend in procession. Musicians played, athletes competed, offerings were brought. At the climax, a great peplos, a woven robe, was presented to the statue of Athena. Women had worked on it all year, threading scenes of myth and battle into its cloth. Draped on the goddess, it was both garment and story. But myths were not just carved in marble. They were breathed in whispers. Some said Athena had no mother, born from Zeus's skull, a warrior already wise. Others spoke of how Hephaestus had once pursued her, and when she escaped, his seed fell upon Gaia, birthing Erichthonius, a serpent child raised by Athena, ancestor of kings. They told too of how the gods debated which city should bear their favour, and of how Athena, goddess of craft and intellect, gave not just the olive tree, but the very gifts of weaving, of reason, of justice. Her owl saw in the dark. Her shield bore the head of Medusa, petrifying folly. She was warrior and strategist, but also mediator and patron. Her Acropolis was no place of thunder. It was a temple of thought. Even the columns, Doric and Ionic, spoke a language of proportion and rhythm, of harmony and symmetry. Nothing was arbitrary. The human body, the cosmos, the polis, all echoed in the geometry of the stone. But time is the true builder and destroyer. Over centuries, the Acropolis would change hands. Romans preserved it. Byzantines converted it. Ottomans turned it into a mosque, even using the Parthenon as a powder magazine, leading to its partial destruction during a Venetian bombardment in 1687. Fragments were scattered, looted, enshrined in distant museums, and yet the spirit remains. When travellers climb the hill today, they ascend not just stone steps, but centuries. They see scaffolding now and weathered blocks, but also the same blue sky Athena once watched. They feel the hush, the pause, the reverence. They become briefly Athenians of old. Great is the fortune of Athens, wrote Thucydides. Our city, because of its greatness, draws the admiration of all mankind. But even more than greatness, it is the questions that endure, chiseled into every pillar, carried on every breeze. What does it mean to live well? What is worth building, and how do we remember? The Acropolis does not answer. It listens. The sun had long since begun its golden descent, drawing long shadows across the flagstones and softening the sharp edges of the city. From the narrow paths winding away from the agora, the clatter of the marketplace dulled to a gentle murmur, as if the city itself were exhaling after the heat of the day. The flick of sandals over packed earth, the scent of olive oil warmed on clay stoves, and the first strains of lyre strings pulled the light into memory. Home, a humble oikos, was not far now. Modest walls of sun-baked mud brick enclosed a courtyard where vines curled upward toward the fading light. Within, the spaces were simple and familiar. A hearth, a few benches, a loom tucked into the corner, amphorae stacked along the wall like sleeping sentries. As the twilight deepened, oil lamps were kindled, small terracotta vessels with open mouths and woven wicks. The glow they cast was soft, golden, and full of breath. One by one, shadows drew back. The flicker was not just for light, but for rhythm, of dinner, of talk, of stories that came before sleep. Light gave shape to faces, made gentle by weariness and wine. In the courtyard, an older man sat beneath a fig tree, a lyre resting gently in his lap. His fingers plucked lazily, more in thought than performance, humming a half-forgotten tune. A child leaned against his knee, eyes heavy but wide, as if listening to the music was a duty before dreams could be allowed in. "What did your teacher say today?" the man asked without looking. The boy rubbed his eyes. He said the soul has its own kind of hunger, and that learning is how we feed it. The man chuckled, tuning a string. "He's right, your teacher, though I wonder if he said that before or after the midday nap." The boy smiled faintly. The music meandered, like the last of the bees weaving home. In a nearby house, laughter bubbled up, not loud but warm, layered with the cadence of family. A mother called out for her eldest to fetch the bread. An aunt teased a nephew about his tousled hair. Someone recited a proverb, badly, and everyone groaned in unison. The meal was simple, as it often was. Olives, barley bread dipped in oil, a few figs, and a bowl of lentils shared between them. On feast days, there might be grilled fish or honey cakes, but even on quiet days like this, the act of sitting together, of breaking bread and offering pieces to others first, had its own sacred quality. In a corner of the courtyard, two women knelt side by side, a mother and daughter, preparing a fresh wick for a lamp. The daughter asked softly, "Do you think the gods can see us when we light the flame?" The mother paused, fingers paused over the clay rim. "If they do, they see the same thing every evening, care and hope and the wish for peace." "Even when we've quarrelled," the girl whispered. The mother smiled. "Especially then." The lyre was more than an instrument. It was a thread to the divine. Formed from tortoiseshell and stretched with gut strings, it was a gift of Hermes to Apollo, or so the myth went. And so, each time a string was strummed, it was like touching the edge of something sacred. Boys learned it as part of their education, not merely for melody, but for memory. Poems, hymns, fragments of Homer. In homes across the city, the lyre's voice was a companion. It echoed before speeches, underlined poetry, and soothed children into sleep. When paired with voice, it gave weight to names: Achilles, Odysseus, Penelope, Orpheus. In a society without books on every shelf, music was how stories walked from generation to generation. Philosophers, too, thought much of music. Pythagoras spoke of harmonic ratios, claiming that the universe itself echoed with music, the music of the spheres. Plato warned of disordered melodies, fearing they might unseat the balance of the soul. To play the lyre well was not just art, it was order. So as night fell and music echoed in quiet corners, it was not only lullaby, it was a tuning of the world. After the meal, while the lamp still burned low, came a quieter moment. The day's final conversation. Two siblings lay stretched on their backs, gazing up at the tiny stars barely visible between vine leaves. Their father, reclining nearby, recited a few lines from a familiar source. "Know thyself," he said. That's what they carved into the temple at Delphi, carved it into the minds of anyone who dared ask a question. The younger of the two blinked. "But how do you know when you've done it? Known yourself?" The father rubbed his chin. "Some say you know when your desires no longer surprise you. Others say you never really do. But trying is where the virtue lies." The eldest added thoughtfully, "My teacher says even Socrates wasn't sure he knew himself, only that he knew nothing for certain." Their father smiled. "A wise kind of ignorance, that." In another household, a priestess of Hestia, now retired, offered a libation at her small shrine. A bit of wine, a whisper of breath, a quiet bow. Hestia, goddess of the hearth, was never one for spectacle. But without her, no fire burned safely. No home was sacred. By her flame, families drew close. Meals were sanctified. Journeys ended and began. Even the most austere philosophers, those who questioned gods and myths alike, seldom doubted the flame. Whether literal or metaphorical, the hearth was centre and sanctuary. As the hour wore on, lamps were snuffed one by one. A few stayed glowing low, a comfort for those who stirred in dreams. Outside, the city murmured its last breaths of the day. Dogs barked softly in the distance. A man coughed, then laughed, then went quiet again. The lyre's final note hung in the air, and in a room where shadows played on whitewashed walls, a mother kissed her child's brow and whispered, "Tomorrow, you'll tell me what else your teacher said." The child, eyes closing, murmured, "He said, the soul follows beauty like bees follow honey." A pause. "Then sleep well, little bee." As twilight crept over the rooftops of Athens and the Acropolis dimmed into silhouette, The city did not fall silent, but shifted its rhythm. The thrum of commerce gave way to the hush of homes, and the symphony of domestic life began its nightly refrain, measured, modest, and deeply human. Ancient Athenian households were typically modest in structure, built of sun-dried mud brick and centered around an interior courtyard. These open-air spaces acted as the heart of the home, where cooking was done, weaving looms clicked softly, and children played in the shadows of amphorae and fig trees. At dusk, these courtyards glowed softly with the light of oil lamps, lichnia, fueled by pressed olive oil and carefully trimmed wicks. Their flame was low and constant, a quiet pulse marking the end of the day. Within the walls of the oikos, or household, roles were clearly delineated. Men often dined reclining on couches in the andron, a room reserved for male guests and symposia. Women oversaw the hearth, wove textiles, managed stores, and supervised children. Meals, depending on wealth and occasion, might be eaten together or separately, though in more humble homes, the family would share food seated on mats around low wooden tables. The typical evening meal, daipnon, was frugal but satisfying. Barley bread, maza, olives, lentils, dried figs, goat cheese and vegetables were staples. Fish was more common than meat, and wine diluted with water was a universal drink, consumed not to inebriate, but to relax the body and open the tongue to stories. A piece of salted cheese wrapped in fig. Leaves might accompany the end of the meal, followed by offerings to Hestia, goddess of the hearth, or Hermes, protector of travelers and thresholds. Evening was also a time of learning. Boys, if educated, might recite Homeric verses or practice their lyre under a teacher's guidance. In wealthier homes, the family might employ a tutor, often a slave, to instruct their sons in reading, numbers, music, and moral conduct. Girls learned domestic management and religious rites from their mothers and grandmothers, preparing to become stewards of future homes. Music permeated every level of Greek life, from public theatre and religious rites to the simplest of domestic moments. In the home, it was a daily presence, subtle yet powerful. The most common household instruments included the lyre, kithara, aulos, and panpipes. The lyre, made from tortoiseshell and gut strings, was favoured for its gentleness and accessibility. Boys learned to play it from youth, often alongside lessons in poetry and song. The kithara, a more elaborate and professional cousin of the lyre, had a deeper sound and was used in festivals or more formal performances. The aulos, a double-reeded instrument, produced a high, reedy sound, sometimes considered wild or passionate, and was often played during ecstatic rituals or mourning ceremonies. Evening music in the home was seldom grand. A parent might hum a lullaby, ainos to a child, or a youth might strum gently while reciting a passage from Hesiod. Music was thought to influence the ethos, the moral character of the soul. In this way, its function was not only aesthetic but deeply ethical. Plato and Aristotle both spoke at length on music's power to shape the soul, and so even modest homes might value music as essential education. Songs might tell of heroes, Heracles, Theseus, Achilles, or recount fragments of Orphic hymns and folk tales. Others were philosophical, short aphorisms woven into melody, used to remember moral precepts. It was said that Socrates, in his later years, began composing simple music to honor a recurring divine dream that urged him to make music and live rightly. Even music's absence, the pauses between notes, the breath before a verse, carried weight in Athenian life. Silence was not emptiness, but a waiting space, where meaning gathered. As darkness fell completely, the city's many shrines, in courtyards, on thresholds, and at the corners of streets, flickered with flame. Small libations of wine or oil were poured, accompanied by whispered prayers. Offerings were made to the household gods. Hestia for peace and fire, Hermes for protection and safe dreams, Apollo for health and clarity of thought. Within homes the night might close with recitation or gentle conversation. It was not uncommon for children to ask questions about the stars, the gods, or the stories they had heard that day. These moments were teaching spaces, gentle instruction folded into story. Lamps would be snuffed with care, lest the fire spirits be offended. Beds were laid with blankets of wool or linen, sometimes perfumed with herbs. Under the roof tiles, family members would drift into sleep beneath a sky still rich with stars. The same sky that looked down on Plato in the academy, that had once seen Pythagoras draw lines in the sand, or Demeter weep for Persephone's descent. In this hush, the city truly breathed. Lamps would be snuffed with care, lest the fire spirits be offended. Beds were laid with blankets of wool or linen, sometimes perfumed with herbs. Under the roof tiles, family members would drift into sleep beneath a sky still rich with stars. The same sky that looked down on Plato in the academy, that had once seen Pythagoras draw lines in the sand, or Demeter weep for Persephone's descent. In this hush, the city truly breathed. Here, shadows of philosophers walked, not ghosts, but echoes. Socrates with his gentle irony, Zeno erect and unmoved, Epicurus smiling beneath a fig tree. They spoke without sound, yet he understood. What is the good life? Is the soul born or becoming? Does the cosmos think us, or do we think it? He wished to ask questions of his own, about suffering, about love, about the quiet fear in all men that they live wrongly. But as he stepped forward, the garden faded. Only the scent of time remained. Now he stood beneath a sky without stars. It was vast but not empty. Columns stretched upward, not of marble but of wind and flame. The air buzzed with unseen truths. There was no temple here, and yet it felt holier than any shrine. A figure appeared, robed in white and crowned not with laurels but with stars. The face was changing, young and old, man and woman, friend and stranger. The figure spoke without mouth. You have walked the world. Now walk yourself. He understood. The journey through Athens, through the agora, the groves, the painted stoa, had always been an inward one. Philosophy, after all, did not begin in scrolls or statues, but in the trembling soul seeking the shape of its own goodness. The figure reached out a hand, a touch like fire and snow, and then he awoke. He lay still for a long time, eyes open to the darkness. The room had not changed. The oil lamp had burned out. A rooster crowed far away, breaking the last thread of night. Somewhere, a neighbor stirred. But something within him had shifted, not revelation perhaps, but resonance. He rose, poured water from a clay jug, and washed his face. The dream was already fading, as dreams do, but its symbols lingered. River, temple, garden, path. He stepped to the doorway, drawing his himation tight around his shoulders. The sky was pale now, not day, not night, but the in-between. And from that stillness he spoke softly to himself. May I think clearly, walk rightly, and greet the day as a friend. Then he smiled. The soul, he thought, is always walking, even when the body sleeps. In the hush between night's last breath and dawn's first stirring, the ancients believed something subtle took hold of the soul. Sleep was not a simple silence, not just the resting of limbs, but a journey. A temporary loosening of the soul from the body, as though it drifted back toward the divine ether from which all souls descended. And dreams? Dreams were glimpses, blurred but radiant, of truths too bright to see while waking. Plato in the Republic hinted that the soul, when it dreams, remembers, that in slumber it retreats from the senses and re-enters the realm of forms, that timeless incorporeal world where beauty is pure, justice unclouded, and the good not contested but known. To sleep, then, was to taste something truer than waking. Aristotle, in his treatise on sleep and sleeplessness, regarded sleep as a physical process, the cooling and slowing of vital fires, the body's way of digesting both food and sensation, but even he admitted its power. In dreams, the mind continued working. It solved problems, revealed patterns. Sometimes it whispered truths that the day had hidden in noise. And yet Heraclitus, with his riddles of fire and flux, once said, "The waking have one common world, but the sleeping turn aside each into a world of his own." In sleep, each soul returned to its own river. The Orphics, mystical inheritors of older myths, believed sleep was a rehearsal for death, that the soul descended nightly into Hades, passing through dreams as through shadows of what would one day come. They sang of the soul as a divine spark, exiled in flesh, destined to return to the stars, if it lived wisely. They left behind fragments etched on gold tablets to be buried with the dead. "I am a child of earth and starry heaven, but my race is of heaven alone." The Greeks did not look at the night sky merely to mark the seasons. They saw the heavens as both clock and code, a moving language written by gods, ancestors, and fate. The stars were not just distant fire, but signs of meaning. Pythagoras believed the cosmos itself made music, the harmony of the spheres, each celestial body emitting a note in an eternal mathematical chord. To him, the soul was aligned to this music, and could be trained to remember it through virtue, silence, and contemplation. Plato, in his dialogue Timaeus, spoke of the soul's origin in the turning of the stars. Each soul, he said, was assigned a star. After death, the virtuous returned to it. To study the heavens, then, was to study oneself. The stars were a kind of mirror. Zeno, the Stoic, saw the universe as a single living being, a divine reason, logos, infused into all matter. The stars were its eyes. Sleep, for the Stoic, was not an escape but part of a rhythm, necessary, natural, governed by the same principles as the motion of the cosmos. To accept sleep was to live in accord with nature. Some philosophers viewed dreams with caution. Could they be trusted? Were they divine, or merely the mind's own echoes? In the temple of Asclepius, god of healing, dreams were sought deliberately. The sick came to sleep in sacred precincts, a practice called incubation. There, in the hush of candlelight and clean linen, they awaited visions from the god. A snake might speak, a figure might touch their brow, and come morning the priests would interpret what had been seen. Others kept personal dream journals, considering the images sacred but deeply personal, and some, like Epictetus, urged restraint. Do not let yourself be carried away by dreams. Wake each day with clarity and live. But still, even the Stoics sometimes dreamed. As the body rests, the mind drifts, and the soul wanders. In this state, ancient thinkers believed, one came closest to knowing what the soul truly was. Is it fire, breath, harmony, memory? They never fully agreed, but all sensed that sleep was not nothingness, that in those hours when the eyes close and the world fades, a door opens inward. In that silence, perhaps the soul recalls its place in the great song of being. And when the dream fades and the day returns, we awaken, not always with answers, but sometimes with better questions. The hour is late. Even the city's shadows have begun to dream. Torchlight flickers low along the colonnades. Doorways are quiet. From somewhere far away, a final lyre note lingers in the cool air, then fades. Athens sleeps. And in the stillness, a single figure lingers beneath the stars, reclining near the edge of a portico, his back to the column, sandals loosened, gaze tilted skyward. This is the hour the Stoics called Eustochia, the good rest, not merely of body, but of thought. The space where the mind is emptied of judgment, the passions are cooled, and the soul listens again to its deeper rhythm. No more lessons, no more questions, only the hush of the polis and the soft thrum of the cosmos. Somewhere above, unseen in the sleeping alleys, an oil lamp burns beside a child's bed. In another courtyard, a mother hums a song she learned when she was small. The same tune, perhaps, her grandmother sang beneath fig trees during the Persian Wars. The stone remembers. So do the trees. And so too does the soul. What does it mean to live well? What does it mean to end a day in peace? The philosopher exhales slowly, as if releasing the last threads of waking thought. A soft breeze stirs from the direction of the sea. It carries salt and stillness and something ancient, something older than the Parthenon, older than the myths themselves. A sense of time folding. Above him, the stars hang suspended in the black like silver coins spilled from a god's hand. He picks out Lyra, the lyre, Orpheus's constellation, whose song could charm death itself. There is Pegasus, the winged horse. There's Andromeda, chained to her fate, yet immortalized in the sky. And above all, there is Athena's owl, circling in the shape of stars only the Athenian poets imagined. To the ancients, the sky was not cold or empty. It was storytelling made luminous, each star a parable, each constellation a thread woven into the fabric of the soul. Tonight the sky is quiet, but not silent, not really. It breathes, slowly, like the city, like the philosopher, resting his head against worn stone. The soul, Plato said, is a charioteer, guiding two horses, one noble, one unruly. Life is the struggle to steer, but tonight there is no struggle. The reins are slack, the chariot sleeps. He thinks, not in words now, but in something softer, of arete, virtue, not as conquest, but as quiet alignment. To live with excellence is not to win. It is to live attentively, harmoniously, in step with reason and beauty. It is to fall asleep as one who has tried and listened and cared. Somewhere nearby a temple owl cries out, 3 low notes, and is gone again. The philosopher closes his eyes. In this moment the air holds no urgency. All the voices of debate have settled. The marble beneath his shoulders is cool. The sky above holds no new truths, only old ones, steady, waiting. He dreams not yet of death, but of stillness, that sacred interval between breath and breath, question and answer, day and dusk. Sleep will come gently now. Long ago, on the last day of his life, Socrates sat in his prison cell surrounded by friends. The hemlock waited. But he spoke not of fear. He spoke of the soul's journey. Death is either a dreamless sleep or a passage to another place where we may talk with those who have gone before. And if it is a sleep, then may it be deep. And if it is a journey, then let us step gently toward it, wrapped in wisdom. Tonight, in this moment, Athens sleeps, the stars hold fast, and somewhere, above fig trees and tiled roofs, above the Acropolis and the hills beyond, a small soul tucks itself inward, at peace beneath the great dome of thought and sky, and nothing stirs but time. Not all knowledge stands in the agora. Some truths are whispered in the dark. The stories of ancient Greece are luminous with names. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras, Heraclitus. Their thoughts echo through centuries, through marble halls and inked parchment. But what of the voices we rarely hear? What of Diotima, the priestess of Mantinea, who taught Socrates the deeper mysteries of love? What of Aspasia, companion of Pericles, praised by Plato for her wisdom and rhetoric? What of the silent thinkers, the mystics, the initiates, those whose knowledge did not pass through the formal channels of academy or lyceum, but flowed through ritual, vision, and sacred dream? Beneath the well-known lines of Athenian philosophy lay another stream, quiet, internal, feminine, and veiled. In the Symposium, Socrates recalls a teacher he reveres above all others, Diotima, a wise woman and seer who spoke not of politics or dialectic, but of eros, the soul's longing for the beautiful. She described love as a ladder, first the love of one body, then the beauty of all bodies, then the beauty of minds, then laws, customs, and knowledge, finally the form of beauty itself, timeless, formless, eternal. It is a mystical ascent, far from the clamour of the agora or the wrestling yard. Whether Diotima was real or a Platonic invention matters less than the truth she embodies. That wisdom can enter through the heart as well as the mind. In the same age, Aspasia of Miletus was known not just for her beauty, but for her mind. She held salons where men of state and thought gathered to debate and reflect. Socrates himself is said to have learned from her. She was foreign, unwed, and unsanctioned, and yet she shaped the intellectual lives of Athens's most powerful voices. Aspasia reminds us, not all philosophy is public, some is intimate. In this, she echoes a whole tradition, that of household wisdom, passed not on scrolls, but in murmured teachings, gestures, and living example. Beyond the academy and the lyceum were sacred paths few spoke of openly, the mystery cults of Demeter at Eleusis, of Dionysus, of Orpheus. Their teachings were not for public debate. They were experiential, transformative, intended not to argue truth, but to awaken it within. Initiates of the Eleusinian mysteries, for example, were forbidden to reveal the rites. Yet we know they underwent symbolic death and rebirth, reenacting the descent of Persephone into the underworld and her return. Plato himself, in his later dialogues, draws heavily from mystic imagery of souls wandering, reincarnating, seeking the light. His myth of at the end of the Republic suggests that the soul chooses its next life based on what it has learned. This is not logic, it is transformation. To the Greeks, philosophy was not merely an exercise of intellect, it was a way of being, a path of the soul. As Plato wrote in the Phaedo, those who truly practice philosophy are preparing to die. But this is no morbid sentiment. It is the idea that through philosophy, one frees the soul from illusion, from desires, from fear, from ignorance, and draws closer to its true form. Death, then, is not an end. It is a return. To the untrained, death is terror. To the philosopher, it is truth unveiled. And yet even this wisdom was often symbolized, veiled, and passed through story, through myths like Orpheus descending into Hades, or Heracles wrestling death itself. Throughout our long night in ancient Athens, we have walked through stoas, olive groves, gymnasia, and homes. We have listened to debates and dreams, but we have also glimpsed what was unsaid, the mothers whispering lullabies rooted in ancient hymns, the wise women weaving parables into cloth patterns, the men who, though trained in logic, turned towards stars and silence for the answers words could not give. We have wandered not only through philosophical doctrines, but through philosophical lives, and the greatest truths, the ones that linger with us now, are not those carved in stone or recited in formal debate. They are truths like, to live well is to live aware, to die well is to die in peace, to know oneself is to begin knowing all. These did not belong to Socrates alone. They did not belong to men alone. They belonged to all who listened, to earth, to silence, to the breath within. And so, as the stars begin to fade, we return to the question that has echoed through every chapter of this journey. In ancient Greece, it was not merely for politics or persuasion. It was for living, for suffering, for joy, for loss. It was for the long road to wisdom that each soul must walk alone, and yet never truly alone, for the path is lit by those who walked before. It was for nights like this, still, silent, under the same sky, and perhaps above all, it was for sleep, for when the mind quiets and the body rests and the soul uncoils from the day, then, perhaps, philosophy walks with us into the night, not with answers, but with peace. As the sun moves, so too does man's thought. Before the wristwatch, before the tolling bell, time passed by shadow and song. In the cities and valleys of ancient Greece, the day unfolded like a scroll read slowly aloud, guided not by numbers but by light, labor, and ritual. And time was not a grid, it was a rhythm, and the Greeks listened to it closely. A day began not at midnight, but with the light, dawn's first glow brushing the hills above Athens. The earliest risers were farmers and bakers, and by sunrise the city began to stir. The Greeks divided daylight into 12 equal hours, regardless of season, meaning a summer hour might be nearly 75 minutes, and a winter hour just 45. These were measured with sundials and clepsydrae, water clocks that dripped steadily in public squares or courtrooms. There were no fixed appointments at 9 o'clock or 3:30. Instead, people spoke of events relative to the sun. Let us meet after the 5th hour. He will speak before sunset. The judgment will come before shadows touch the eastern wall. At night, stars and moonlight ruled. Those who knew how to read them, sailors, shepherds, stargazers, held an unspoken calendar in their minds. Time then was felt, in the length of a shadow, the tilt of the sun, the slant of morning winds. Daily life followed natural needs. Morning brought gathering, teaching and trade. Midday demanded rest in the shade, especially in the hotter months. Evening was for meals, music, storytelling and prayer. Meals came twice, a light ariston around midday, and a larger deipnon at dusk. After dark, the oil lamps were lit, and homes filled with flickering conversation. This was a culture of balance between body and spirit, work and leisure, solitude and society. The Stoics and Epicureans both spoke of moderation, not as limitation, but as wisdom lived. To live by the sun's path was to be in harmony with cosmos, the Greek idea of ordered beauty. Beyond the hours, the Greeks lived by cycles of moon and harvest, festival and war. Their calendar wasn't one unified system. Each city had its own version, with lunar months of 29 or 30 days. Intercalary months, bonus months added to keep pace with the solar year, were adjusted by priests or civic councils. The year spun through sacred festivals marking transitions: Anthesteria in early spring, the festival of wine and the dead; Thargelia in May, offerings to Apollo, cleansing of the city; Panathenaea in midsummer, games, song, sacrifice and civic pride; Eleusinian mysteries in autumn, secret rites, mourning and rebirth. Each season was a mood, each celebration a thread in the social and spiritual fabric. Time wasn't linear, it was a spiral. Even death was not seen as a final full stop, but as a return, a cycle, a hidden passage. The Greeks had two words for time: chronos, the steady, measurable passing of seconds and days; kairos, the opportune moment, when time opens like a door. Where chronos ticks, kairos listens. It is the right time to speak, to choose, to act. Not defined by clocks, but by the quality of the moment. To act in kairos was to align oneself with the deeper flow of nature and fate. Philosophers and poets alike honored it. Hesiod speaks of timing as wisdom. In rhetoric, kairos meant knowing when a word would strike deepest. Even in warfare, generals sought not constant motion, but the right moment to strike. In this sense, the Greeks lived not just by time, but by timeliness. To the Greeks, time was not just outer structure, it was the canvas of the soul. In Plato's Phaedrus, the soul is eternal, but life is a forgetting, a temporary exile from true knowledge. Time, then, becomes the journey back. Pythagoreans believed in metempsychosis, the migration of souls. Each life, each century, was part of a long unfolding of the inner self. Dreams, too, were messages from a place beyond time, where past and future touched. Oracles spoke not in calendar dates, but in symbols, riddles, and mood. The gods arrive when they choose. And what of us, thousands of years later, listening in dim rooms or lying still beneath our own ceilings of stars? We too chase time. We digitize it, schedule it, fear its passing. But the Greeks remind us, time can be listened to, not only measured. Moments can be entered, not just consumed. Seasons can shape us, not just pass us by. And above all, that even in stillness we are moving, in a spiral, towards something remembered, something longed for, something true. So tonight, as this final chapter closes, breathe with the rhythm of the stars. Let Kairos visit you, softly, like an old friend. Time, in ancient Greece, was never a taskmaster. It was a guide. The house has long since hushed. The wine has been poured, the lyre's final chord fading into memory. One lamp still burns, its small flame bending slightly in the breath of night. The walls are soft with silence, the city distant in sleep. You sit beneath the stars, the same stars the philosophers once gazed upon. Somewhere an owl calls. Somewhere another sleeper stirs and returns to their dream. In the warm shadows of this imagined Athens, everything has slowed. Thought drifts like incense. No questions remain, only the sense that they were once asked and once mattered. The world has not ended, only quieted, as it does every night. Tomorrow again the agora will fill with voices. The sun will warm the marble steps. Children will chase each other in olive groves. A philosopher will pause mid-thought, eyes narrowed toward the Acropolis. But for now, there is only this stillness, and you, breathing in the air of an old world, letting it settle gently around your heart, not to learn more, only to remember that it was all here, once, and perhaps always is. Good night, from ancient Greece and from a time beyond time.